It was the most exciting and exhilarating moment of my life. So we went from a low point in 67, and here 2.5 years later, we're on our way to the moon. It's almost unbelievable. After the fire, major tragedy, as that thing lifted off, I think everybody had chill bumps. We're going to the moon? Are you kidding me? There's still people out there, the non-believers, everything was NASA simulation and so forth like that. And I hate to tell you, you're wrong. I was there. They did make it. They walked on the moon.
Welcome to the User Defenders Podcast, where we interview UX superheroes who fight for the users in order to inspire and equip you to do the same. And now, here's your host, Jason Ogle.
Greetings, User Defenders. Welcome to this very special, quite literally out-of-this-world episode with my father, George Jim Ogle. You know how they say it doesn't take a rocket scientist? Well, my dad is one. On my recent vacation to Florida to celebrate his 80th birthday, he spent nearly 3 hours telling me his story. I realized after that I didn't properly introduce him during our interview, so I'll take a second to do that on the outset. My father has a 51-year aerospace career, which started in 1958 with missiles, and he's one of the few who can say he was part of every manned moon mission, as well as all 135 space shuttle missions. My dad's backstory is definitely superhero related, to kind of stick with the theme of the show here. You'll hear him tell of his tragic beginnings and of overcoming great adversity despite it. Since this is a design podcast, you'll also be pleased to know that there is at least one space story he tells that speaks to a design flaw that tragically cost the lives of 3 men. If you saw The Right Stuff, that movie, you know what I'm talking about. He'll dive into that. He was there when that happened. I was hoping it would get dusty in the room, either him or me, and I'm happy to report that it did, but I won't tell you who. You'll have to listen all the way to the end. Hey, no fast forwarding. That's more than enough of an intro, I think. I sincerely hope you enjoy this very special conversation with my father as much as I did having it. So, I'm here with my father, Jimmy George Ogle, and this is something I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and I am just so grateful that this opportunity opened up, that we could spend this time together. I'm so thankful, Dad, that you've made this time to capture this. This is you have quite an astounding story, and I really feel like this is going to be really important to capture and to for prosperity and also for enlightenment. I know that there's a lot of people that are going to listen to this that don't know that very much about the history of the space program and all of the incredible achievements that have been for mankind and history. And I mean, so I'm just super excited to have you here and to be sharing this time with me. So thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the opportunity to do this. I consider it an honor. And like you said, a lot of people don't know about it because a lot of people weren't even born yet.
That's exactly right.
I run into a lot of those that I'm talking to, and I am talking like, they saw the moon landing and all that. Sometimes they come back and tell me, I wasn't born yet, sir. That's just to put me in perspective. Oh, that's right. It happened almost 50 years ago. But anyway, yeah, let's get started.
Awesome.
I'm excited about it.
All right, so let's get started here. You are one of the few people that can say you got involved in this, the very middle of the missile program. You were at the very beginning and end of the Apollo Saturn program, including every manned moon mission. You
Correct.
were part of that. And all 135 space shuttle launches.
Correct.
And that's incredible. And this all started with you as a 12-year-old boy. Your space rocket man mission all started with you being 12 years old, wading in the Banana River, not far from where we are now, and trying to catch some fish. And why don't you tell us that story? I don't want to. Well, you know it better than I do.
That's a good lead-in because that's exactly what happened. And it was school was out. I think I just gotten out of the 8th grade, and every summer you can't wait till you get out there and do what we love to do, fish and hunt, and that's what we did here in little old Cocoa, Florida, Merritt Island, when I was growing up. And I was waiting. I got up one morning, had my breakfast, went out in the Banana River to catch some mullet, catch bigger fish with. It was bait. And while I'm waiting there, I hear this crackling sound. It's about 9:30 in the morning, and the day was July 24th, 1950. And I looked toward the Cape area where the sound was coming from, and I'm seeing this contrail, going up in the sky with this crackling noise. I had absolutely no idea what it was or what I was witnessing at the time. But the very next day, in the Cocoa Tribune, our local mullet wrapper, we called it, newspaper, front page of the paper there showed this V2 rocket with a Whack Corporal second stage on it, lifting off from Cape Canaveral. And I've forgotten exactly what the words were, but I just remembered the picture. I was still young. I wasn't a big newspaper, but I remembered the picture. I'll never forget it. It showed the scaffold. They were using paint scaffolding for the gantry to work on the rocket, and it was in the background as the thing was taken off in the photograph. And it had that Wernher von Braun was there with his team from Huntsville, Alabama. The ABMA, Army Ballistic Missile Agency, is what they called it then. And they were launching a V2 rocket with a United States-built Army Whack Corporal second stage. And the purpose of that was to demonstrate staging. They'd been shooting a lot of the V2s out in Mexico, and the program was called Bumper. I don't know how they came up with that, but it was Bumper 1, 2, 3, and 4. And by the time they moved that program to the Cape to do that, this staging capability or demonstrate it with that Whack Corporal missile, it was number 8, Bumper 8. So they attempted to launch the thing. It took off, and after it got to 50,000 feet or something like that, as I recall reading a story later, the staging didn't really occur, but they reached a very high altitude. And it was right here off of Cape Canaveral, Florida, the very first launch. And I witnessed that. And little did I know at the time, what I was witnessing. But as it says in the book that is out, has been published, I'm in the opening act there of this book called Rocket Ranch. And a lot of us, the whole book is about our experiences and so forth. And I'm in the opening act in the very first chapter there talking about this experience that I had. Witnessing the very first launch from Cape Canaveral that really started the missile program first.
What was it about seeing that what did that do to you? Seeing that missile in the air, not knowing what it was, and then finding out later what was it?
I was absolutely astounded, and I asked my dad later when he came home from work that afternoon. I said I was telling him about it, and he didn't know anything about it. It was kind of a secret deal. It wasn't published. And it wasn't, nobody knew that it was happening until it happened the next day and it was in the paper. So, and then my dad, showed me the paper and said, this is what you saw yesterday. Oh, wow. I didn't know Wernher von Braun from Adam and, or anybody on his team. It said his name there in the paper. And I don't think my dad knew much about it either. But as it turned out, that same guy that launched that very first rocket here, the V2, did become the grandfather, if I'll use that term, for the design for the rocket, the great Saturn V rocket that got us to the moon and back. And that was Dr. Wernher von Braun.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that because you have some interesting stories, especially an encounter with the legendary Dr. Wernher von Braun.
Yes, I did, yes.
So I want to ask you about that later, but I want to kind of now switch gears now that we've kind of set the stage.
Right.
I want to switch gears, and I want to kind of go back to the beginning, so to speak. And the show User Defenders is my podcast, and as you know, and a lot of it's superhero themed, and I like to start with origin stories. Just like we wouldn't know much about the superheroes that we read about if we hadn't known their origin story and kind of what made them who they are.
That's right.
So I like to start, and I'd like to go back because you have a really interesting story, and there's been a lot of hardship and a lot of adversity that you've overcome. And I think that's really going to be important to this conversation. So let's start almost at the very beginning. Your real name is George.
I was named after my grandfather. George Brown Ogle was his name. I was named after him. And when I came home from the hospital, my sister Diana, who was 2 years old at the time, had been playing with a newborn baby that had gotten home just before I did, and his name was Jimmy Davis. And when I came home from the hospital, she thought all babies were named Jimmy. So she says, "Oh, I got have me a little Jimmy now." When they brought me home from that, so it was kind of a nickname, and it stuck. And I really preferred that because when I did go to school, there was this little saying that they used to say, "Georgie, porgy, pudding pie," and
Kissed all the girls and made them cry.
Yeah, exactly. and I was hit with that a couple of times, but the name stuck, and I grew up with that nickname, and that was my also known as on my security when I filled out the security paper, because you had to give your legal name and any other also known as names, and that stuck. So when I got into working in the missile industry later on, the people named me Jamie, and that kind of stuck all the way through the Douglas era when I was with Douglas Aircraft. But that's how I got my moniker Jimmy, which became obviously Jim.
Yeah. And I can't imagine you not being Jimmy.
There you go. Everybody knows me as Jim Ogle.
Yeah. So there's Jimmy, Jimbo, Jamie,
Jimmy George.
James, Jimmy. But Jimmy seems like
I answered all of them.
Yeah. So what was life like growing up for you? Family life, and what were your parents like? And
well, I was a regular, normal family, and pretty much, all families have some sort of dysfunctions and other idiosyncrasies. We all do. But basically, my dad I was very close to him because he taught me how to fish, how to throw a cast net, how to get bait, and how to, to survive. I mean, if anything ever happened where I had to go out and get food, I mean, when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, he was teaching me how to throw that cast net and catch fish, which if you can catch fish, if you can eat fish every day, and you can survive. But so I had a very close relationship with my dad, and he later on, after an accident that I was involved in when I was 8, he taught me how to pitch a baseball, and that did well for me later on in high school. Him teaching me how to pitch off a mound with an affliction that I had. We can talk about that whenever you're ready.
Definitely want to hear about that.
Yeah. But whenever you're ready, we can talk about moving on to, when I was 8 years old.
Yeah. Let's go there. Tell us the story. Something very impactful happened to you when you were 8.
When I was 8 years old, I was involved in a very, very serious school bus accident, a school bus wreck. And my sister and I were going to a Catholic school in Lake Worth, Florida. And they were using a 1937 Packard station wagon, which was what they used to call the old Woodies, made out of wood. And we had 12 children packed in that thing, and that was their school bus because it was kind of crude. And it was 1946, and we were coming home on Federal Highway, and we were coming through an intersection there in Lake Worth on Federal Highway, which was old US 1. And I heard screaming in the back, and I was positioned right in the passenger seat, right up in front. And I was looking down at a book from a kid that was sitting right next to me, and then there was a driver driving. And as I was looking down, I heard the screams in the back, and the next thing you know, we're rolling around, and I didn't realize what had happened, but the door flew open as we were rolling, and I got ejected and wound up on the highway. But what had happened was taxi cab going over 60 miles an hour T-boned us right over the rear axle.
Mm-hmm. Describe the taxi cab too.
The taxi cab,
Ford.
Yeah, there's an old Plymouth.
Plymouth.
And what the story was is he was trying to get some lady to catch an airplane out at Lake Worth Airport, and he was flying through that intersection, and we just happened to be there at that particular time. But I wound up out on the highway after, being flipped around and flopped around and everything, because I was ejected immediately on the first roll, and we rolled 2 or 3 times. And as we were rolling, the thing was coming apart because it was made out of wood, and these 12 kids were being scattered around. But my sister was still stuck inside when they finally came to rest on the front yard of the Lake Worth police station. And I'm out here on the highway, and on the side of the highway, and I'm looking at the bottom of this thing, and I see the wheels spinning, and I'm still hearing people scream in the school bus. And I tried to get up, and I couldn't get up from the highway. And I looked down at my legs. I had no feeling from the waist down in both of my legs. And I looked down, and here is my right shoe up on my abdomen, and my foot's still in it. So my right leg had been bent right up, broken, and was right up here on my abdomen. And my left leg was kind of sticking out at an angle. And so what had happened was, and I had a very serious injury because I was bleeding to death out there. All these people start gathering around you when they see something like this, and the traffic had stopped and all, and they were all looking down at me, and I heard somebody saying, "Hey, let me at that boy. I need to put a tourniquet on him." And he did, fashioned this tourniquet and tightened it up, told me how to control it every now and then, and he had a little stick there. And when they came to pick me up in the ambulance people told me that it probably saved my life. But anyway, I'm laying down there on the street, and this cop is standing over me with his pad and his pencil, and he's asking, I'm bleeding to death. And I'm looking up at him. "What's your name, Sonny? Who are your parents? Where do you live?" And all this stuff. And that's when the gentleman that essentially was a guardian angel.
That's what I think.
He just at the right time showed up and saved my leg and saved my life probably. Eventually, they were able to save my leg. They wanted to take it off. It wouldn't take much, some scissors, and it was gone. But my dad, when he arrived at the hospital, said, "No, let's try and save his right leg. We can always take it off later." And that's exactly, the doctor said, "Okay, we'll try, but it's, the infection is huge. He's got a wide open wound there, and we'll see what we can do." And it just so happened, long story short, I wound up in the hospital for 6 months and several operations and a 20-pound weight on my left leg to pull it out because it was rammed up in my hip joint about 3 inches, and there was no way that they could pull it out with human pressure. So they just put 20-pound weight on my leg and let it pull out. And 4 weeks later, it finally locked in place, came down in place, and they cut the stuff down. But that was very painful. And then the second painful operation was when they had to take the skin off my thighs for skin graft.
Grafting, yeah.
And that was very painful. And so there were 2 nights there at that hospital, and over that 6-month period that I kept the whole hospital up for a couple of nights. But
Screaming
I
in
walked,
agony, right?
screaming. Yeah, it hurt. It hurt because when they take the skin off of you, it's like a second, third degree burn.
Oh man!
And they took off too much. They told my dad, "Well, we only needed to take off the piece on the abdomen. We're sorry, we took all that skin off your son's 2 thighs. We had to get rid of it." Yeah. But anyway, that happened. But the miracle of the whole thing was I walked out of that hospital 6 months later on my own steam.
6 months.
Walked out and never looked back.
And the doctors told you you'd get how long out of your leg?
Yeah, he said the 2 doctors that worked on me, they told me they told my dad that I might get 10 years if I'm lucky out of the leg because it was so damaged. It's just bone on bone. Here I am 70 some odd years later, 72 years later, I'm still walking on it. So I am a product of a miracle.
Amen to that.
Amen.
Yeah. So, I mean, no doubt an injury like that is, obviously it's not pretty and unfortunately, and it's just something that you that's the cards that you were dealt, so to speak. And your whole story is a story of overcoming adversity. And I know that we're going to get even more into how you've done that, but I think that's a significant part of it.
It is a significant
having that handicap and having that in being in school, having to go through school with that. And the kids are mean, obviously.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Had to go. Yeah.
What was that like?
They pretty much, for about a year and a half or something like that, I had the drainage, that would come out on my pants and so forth, and they make fun of that and so forth. And my leg was actually, indented and bent in. They couldn't set it straight what they had to work with. Yeah. But the beauty of the whole thing and of the miracle was that I was so young that, you're a kid, you haven't really developed your adult functioning brain like, why did God do this to me? Or, I was so young, I just shook it off and I kind of ignored the fact that it had happened. But what it did do, I got my first taste of playing football when I was about a year before, and in the park where we were living next to, and I really loved the game. So obviously, the doctors told me, you don't you ever play football. That's out. We suggest you don't play basketball either, and I wanted to be, sports. So the only thing that was left was baseball, and we'll talk about that later. But also, I was always enamored. If you ever see any of the pictures of me in the hospital when I was on the bed, you'll see all these airplanes hanging down from this contraption where they had my leg in traction to, pull the weight out, and they had airplanes everywhere. I loved airplanes, and I wanted to fly so bad. And this injury kept me out of the Air Force. I tried to get in the Air Force 3 times. Yeah. And finally, the flight surgeon on the third attempt told me to read this paragraph in this book about scar tissue. And he said, Sonny, and I told him, I said, well, I've tried a couple other places. He says, you don't need to try anymore. This paragraph right here keeps you out. You will never be a pilot. So the next best thing was I said, well, maybe I can build airplanes and be around them. So that's where we'll get into that, where I eventually got into Georgia Tech and the School of Aeronautical Engineering. And I was there for a while and ran out of money. And I was going into my third quarter of my junior year, ran out of money, and my car payments, I was 2 payments behind on my car that I'd had a note with at the local bank here in Cocoa, Florida. And when I got out, they were getting ready to repossess my car, and I told them what the situation was, that I'd run out of money. I was, and I wanted to go back to Georgia Tech and finish up, but I'd have to, work a while and get some money back. And they said, well, if you can just pay the interest on, these payments for the next couple of months, which was $5 or $10 a month, I says, I can do that. So I was able to keep my car, and I was able to find a job out. I went job hunting, obviously, as a college dropout, and I walked into Douglas Aircraft Company on Cocoa Beach there, and I sat down with somebody, and they said, you got any college experience, high school, what's your education? I said, well, I'm third quarter junior at Georgia Tech and the School of Aeronautics. Oh, well, you got a little bit of, you know how to write? I says, well, yeah, I can write a little bit. And I says, we're looking for a technical writer. And I says, I'm your man. $2.36 an hour. So, and they hired me to write flight test reports. And at that particular time, 58, the Douglas Company had got the contract to build a missile called a Thor missile. And it was an intermediate range ballistic missile, meaning that it could throw a warhead about 1,300 nautical miles. A nuclear warhead, and we were right in the middle of the Cold War then, trying to catch up with the Russians, because the Russians had already developed the capability with an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, that they could hit us with if nuclear war ever broke out between us. And back then the Cold War was going on, so we were kind of behind in the missile industry and trying to catch up. But this little 1,300 nautical mile missile had to be deployed close to our enemy, which would mean in England, Turkey. We had squadrons over there that were deployed and pointed at targets and so forth. But as they finally were able to get our ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, meaning you could go over 6,000 miles. We could reach Russia from our homeland here, and it was called an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. And what we had liquid-fueled ones at first, which was the Titan and the Atlas that were being developed. And the Atlas was the one, obviously, that John Glenn went into orbit on, and that was an ICBM, an actual missile that they didn't put the warhead on. They put his Mercury capsule on and put him in space. No way. And they were liquid-fueled, but eventually Boeing came out with a Minuteman, was solid-fueled. So the storage requirements, not having to fuel something for several minutes, and wasting time when you got incoming warheads. These ICBMs that were solid, they're on the ready. You flip a switch, you push a button, and they're gone. So that's what was the beauty of going into the Minuteman system, which was a solid propellant missile with a warhead on it. And now they have missiles with more than one warhead. They have multiple warheads that can be targeted at individual targets as one missile goes into the air. you might have 5 warheads on there, and they can pick out targets. It's just amazing what we have today. But I do remember that the accuracy of that Thor. Here you are, 1,300 miles away, nautical miles, by the way. Everything was in nautical miles back then. And they said they still use it today. And a nautical mile is 15% longer than a statute mile, which we're accustomed to today. But anyway, when we had a mills net, what they call a mills net down there, hydrophones, it was a splash net where the warheads would come in. And I was amazed. Just being out of college and everything, college dropout, the accuracy and how they were doing this was just black magic, how they could fire something and hit within an eighth of a mile. And an eighth of a mile with a nuclear blast could still, wipe out quite an area. Mm-hmm. But eventually, when they deployed the ICBMs, they brought the Thors back from Project Emily, was the deployment of the Thor missiles in England. And NASA purchased 12 of these Thor missiles that they were going to use as boosters. Well, what had happened, NASA had gotten developed during the Eisenhower years. It used to be this administration that was over aeronautics and airplanes was called the NACA. I think it was called National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. Eisenhower signed a bill changing the NACA to NASA, National Association of Space Administration, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And NASA was developed, 1958.
Okay.
So that was the beginning of NASA, and they were trying to develop satellites to catch up. That was the thing we want to go into next. Russia had taken an ICBM in 1957 and launched it and put up this ball called Sputnik and into space. And the world was in awe of Russia, and including us. We said, holy mackerel, we need to try. We're behind. We need to try and get something up there. So they did have a Vanguard missile. The Navy and Air Force had put this thing together to try and get up this grapefruit-sized ball on a Vanguard rocket that they had developed. And it was failure after failure after failure. And finally, there was this guy by the name of Wernher von Braun who had been working on his own rocket called the Jupiter rocket, and which you could make a configuration with the Jupiter rocket into a Juno rocket. And failure after failure, they finally went and called up, our government called on Mr. von Braun. Hey, you think you can put something up for us? Yes, I'll try, And in January of 58, he put up Explorer 1, and that was Wernher von Braun's really initiation into our space race and gaining that significance that he eventually came up with for the moon missions. And continuing on, that Sputnik project put everybody was in awe of Russia. And Kennedy had just been elected in 1960, and he took office in 61. And 4 months after he was in office, the next thing you know, you read in the paper, Russia puts a human being in space in April of 61. He'd only been in office 4 months. And it was Yuri Gagarin. And here again, we are stunned. The whole world is stunned because Russia's beat us again in space. So they were, the technology that they had, it was that people were in awe of. And President Kennedy called in the executives as part of NASA, the newly formed NASA. And it was James Webb, I think, was their top guy with some other people, called him into his office. Right after this news broke about Yuri Gagarin going into space, so now Russia's done two things. One in 57 with Sputnik, and one in 61 with the first human in space. And Kennedy says, what in the world are they going to do next, people? Well, sir, they're going to the moon. He says, going to the moon? Yes, sir. We got to beat them. Now, a lot of people said, from that point that don't know too much about it, that Kennedy must have been a space visionary and all that stuff. The only thing Kennedy was thinking of is, we got to beat them to the moon. And he made the speech in May of 61 that famous speech. I can't give you the exact words, but we need to go to the moon, take men to the moon, and return them safely to Earth. That famous speech before the decade is out. And so he made that speech in 61. The decade would have been 1970.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, long story short on that, 6 months before the decade was out, 2 people walked on the moon for the first time, Apollo 11 mission. We'll get to that. But being with Douglas on the missile program, I made enough money to pay off my car. And my supervisor called me in one day, and I'd been with Douglas for 4 years, and I had gone out of technical writing to writing the technical reports to an electrical and mechanical draftsman, because I had drafting experience from being in college, and especially in the aeronautical school, where we had to do some sort of geometry, where we had to do warp surfaces and everything else. But it gave me a lot of experience in drafting, so that job suited me well. And I did pretty well at it. And my supervisor called me in and said, "How long have you been out of Georgia Tech?" And I said, "About 4 years." He says, "I advise you to go back before you forget everything." And it was good advice. But he says, "What school were you in?" I says, "Aeronautical, the School of Aeronautics, there at Guggenheim Institute at Georgia Tech." And he said, "Sonny, we don't do airplanes here. We do missiles." And it was still missiles. And I said, "What do you recommend?" He says, most everything here is electrical. We do a lot of electrical. Now, there's aerodynamicists that have aeronautical engineering degrees. They do trajectory analysis and things like this, but the things that make these things function mostly in the missiles is electrical. So I went back to Georgia Tech, met with the Dr. Benjamin Jasher, who was the director of the School of Electrical Engineering up there on Saturday. He didn't meet me. He forgot the meeting. I had to call him up. I flew up there. And he didn't show up. I had to call him on the phone. "I'm sorry, son, I'll be there in 20 minutes. And we sat down for a couple of hours. He transferred everything from the school of my courses that I had taken in my junior year as technical electives, and signed me up. Says, "Okay, I'm accepting you into my School of Electrical Engineering, but you ain't going to," I say you ain't, "you aren't going to be a third quarter junior in my school." I says, "Where am I going to be?" He says, "I'm recycling you back to your first quarter junior, which starts the curriculum." And I says, "Fine, that's fine." 2 years later, I got out and I went back to Douglas Aircraft. It was still Douglas Aircraft. And lo and behold, we were starting to launch the Saturn with a live second stage that my company built called the S4. So on the Saturn 1. It was called the Saturn 1 with a dummy second stage that they were launching. They'd launched, I think, 4 of them. Was called the Block 1 program. And as soon as we put a live S4 stage, which my company built, that had 6 RL-10 engines on it, 15,000 pounds thrust apiece, 90,000 pounds and the whole thing was heavier than what the thrusting, but after you use up the propellant, you could accelerate. It was that particular vehicle. It was the beginning of my Saturn experience right after I got out of college, and we were checkout engineers. And what does checkout engineers do? Because people say, "Hey, you build it, you design." No, we don't design anything. Everything's designed. It comes in. You have to learn the systems, and you have to make sure that those systems work. How do you do that? Well, you learn it, and then you write a procedure to check it out, make sure that everything is working per specification.
It's like QA, like quality assurance? Or?
No, it's not quality assurance. It's actually, you will be looking at there's many subsystems. There's systems, and then there's subsystems of those systems. Mm-hmm. And in any rocket or any stage vehicle, space vehicle, and there's many of them. You can choose what you want, or somebody can assign them. Like the engine part or the propulsion part that you load the locks. the cryogenics on, the measurement systems, the telemetry, all these systems. And I had been assigned an instrumentation system, measuring system, telemetry, RF system, and the J2 engine system. And so you learn those systems. You write procedures because there are measurements that come out of these systems that will give you readings via telemetry, what we call telemetry, as to how the system is performing. And everything you have go, no go, high limit, low limit, and you have to make sure that everything is within limits on that particular system. So you have to learn the system well enough to write that procedure to where you activate that system by itself, and then later on as an integrated system, how does this fit into the whole overall scheme of things? And that comes later, but checking out systems individually first on the particular stage you're on. And then eventually you take your stage and you stack it with other stages, like we did when we eventually got to the Saturn V over in the vehicle assembly building that was built to house that. And the first time to do a vertical checkout, stack these things. And then you do integrated testing, wherein all these other stages have done their individual testing, and now you test it as a integrated system, how everything will work when you push the button to let that thing go, all the sequential items that have to happen. So you test and you test and you test because there's human beings on board.
Right.
And it's a lot different than when you're just having a satellite or something like that. The restrictions and the requirements are kind of less, and you don't have as much redundancy. But when you're talking human beings, now you're talking, hey, everything's got to work right.
Yeah.
But I'll give you a break now.
Well, this is great, and I mean, there's so much information, and I know it's like all stuff that a lot of us we just aren't familiar with.
That's
so
right.
This is really, really good stuff. And
thankfully
we have Google too to help us kind of even further. But
let me interject about how we wound up with a real quick story on Wernher von Braun. I think we told you that. At the end of World War II, Wernher von Braun had developed this weapon system called the V-2 rocket. It had experienced the loss of human life, but he was always interested in space. But he had to develop these rockets, and he had done it with slave labor that they had given him. But at the end of the war, Germany was getting ready to surrender. He wanted to surrender to the Americans because he knew what the Russians would be doing to him and his team. And so he made arrangements to surrender to the U.S. At the end of the war. And with that, he had a team of about 700 people, technicians, engineers, that he brought with him over to America. And Truman had signed this act to allow them to come here. It's called Operation Paperclip, to bring over these Germans. What were they brought over here for? To teach us and get our engineering involved in developing missiles as a weapon system, like he had done, and used it successfully in a lot of cases. So they were going to do a brain drain on him and his. That's all they wanted to do. But eventually, he had developed this Jupiter rocket, and this Redstone rocket that Alan Shepard had gone up on earlier, which was a smaller rocket than the Jupiter. But he was the grandfather of the development of those missiles. They were missiles at first. And eventually when NASA got involved, you don't talk missiles anymore because that's a deterrent. It's a military term and so forth. And our field station manager one time said, well, what the heck do you call the thing now? Because we call it a rocket or we call it a vehicle, but don't use that word anymore, missile.
Okay.
Not for NASA. But anyway, and that's a truism because NASA is for peaceful space exploration.
I've never thought of the rockets, like they're basically manned missiles, right? Like in a way, especially the early ones.
Well, they weren't designed for man. They were designed to throw a warhead, a nuclear device.
Right.
But were developed to get us into the manned space program, and they took these missiles and adapted them to the Mercury capsule, which was the one-man capsule at first, and the little Redstone rocket, which was a suborbital flight along just with Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom were the two first flights of that, and the only flights. And it was suborbital, 15-minute flight up, and they did reach orbital altitude and came back down the ocean, 15-minute flights. Those were the first two. Then they stepped over to the bigger rocket called the Atlas, which was could throw a warhead 6,000 miles, nuclear warhead, and that was a missile as well. And then put the Mercury capsule there.
Wow.
And said, now we're going to try and orbit the Earth.
Oh, wow.
With a human being and try and catch up with Russia. And we did with John Glenn on the top.
We lost a few monkeys, though, in the process, right?
We did lose a few monkeys. And the fact that the Atlas was the most beautiful thing when it blew up that you ever saw. And there was quite a few of them that I witnessed that would blow up because the skin was made out of stainless, real thin stainless, and you had to keep pressure in it or the thing would buckle before you. But as soon as you put the juice in it, I say the propellants in it, it became a rigid body. And it was okay, but you always had to keep 5 pounds of pressure or something in the thing to keep it. But when they would blow up, you see these little sequins, floating down, and it was spectacular. But they eventually got it corrected, just like engineers do. They finally figure out what's going on, and you correct it, and you move on, and you don't have that particular problem again. So they felt like they were pretty confident that this Atlas, but the 2 Atlas missions before, I think, had blown up. So when John Glenn climbed on that thing, I have to admit, I was standing in front of Hangar L, and we were about 2 miles away when we witnessed him taking off that day in February of '62. And what a joyous moment that was for all of America. We finally, but it was a year after Russia had put their Yuri Gagarin in space. But we did make it, and that was really the beginning of us, breaking into and catching up with Russia, because we had 3 more launches on the single-person Mercury spacecraft, and then that was the end of that. And then we transitioned into what they call the Gemini capsule, which was a 2-person capsule that we did have to develop a technique for what they call rendezvous in orbit, where you send up one capsule and you send up another one, and they meet in orbit. That's called rendezvous, and there's quite a bit of heavy math involved with that. So we had several Gemini missions, 2-person missions, and these were astronauts that would eventually be flying to the moon that were on those programs. And the original, we call the original 7, and then the original 14, and so forth. And those are the names we remember and that dying off now. And there's just a few of them left, but from that generation. And now we have the new ones from the Shuttle era. But there's so many of them now that you kind of lose track. But the missions like Apollo 13 and Apollo 11, the first moon landing, and all that, those names are still historic, and a lot of people remember them or read about them in books and so forth. The people that weren't there,
absolutely.
But it was an awesome sight. I think I got sidetracked a little bit, but I wanted to get in that story about Wernher von Braun, how he got over here. Under the Truman paperclip, they called it the Operation Paperclip.
That's really important. I'm glad you mentioned that.
And thank God we got him instead of the Russians. The Russians did get a bunch of those German scientists that helped develop their programs, but we got the main man that got us to the moon and back. Go ahead.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I think of Wernher von Braun, and I mean, I don't know a lot about it. I know the name, I know what he did, but I mean, how did this guy... he's an anomaly. He is. He is
an anomaly. Yes.
I mean, you didn't have Google. You didn't have no. How did he learn this stuff?
Well,
how in the world?
Well, they had very good universities over there in Germany. Okay. I mean, they had some brilliant people.
Yeah.
And he was a true scientist, physicist, engineer, whatever you want, all rolled into one. And the guy always had this desire for space, even at a young age.
Wow.
And it just so happened his country got into war. And so he was put in charge of the missile development, the V1. There was a V1 buzz bomb, they called it, also that was a predecessor to the V2 rocket. But they both did damage. And it was the beginning of, the true development of rocketry is what he really accomplished. And there was taint on him and his group because of, the war. And people got killed. However,
Germany was not very popular.
That's right. And I do remember somebody challenged Wernher von Braun about it, and he says, you will do a lot when there is a German Luger pointed at your head. And that could have been the reason, but he always wanted to use space for peaceful purposes. It just so happened he got wound up in World War II. But we did get him, and we got his knowledge, and we got his team.
Yeah.
And I'm glad we did.
Yeah, me too. So you actually, speaking of Wernher von Braun, Dr. von Braun, you have an interesting story of an encounter. I know he was in the same zone as you.
He was in the blockhouse when, for every mission, a Saturn mission, he would come down from Huntsville, Alabama, where he was director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, And he would always be in the blockhouse, and we up on the second floor was where we had the consoles, and the blockhouse was on a 12-foot thick of concrete to withstand the blast, But it was a little two-story, kind of a dome-like thing. That was blockhouse 37. And the blockhouse 34 was where we had the Apollo 1 flyer, but they were both very similar. And they were designed for the early Saturn rockets called the Saturn 1 and the Saturn 1B, which could not go to the moon. They could only do orbital, what they call low Earth orbit missions. There was only one that could go to the moon. That was the mighty Saturn V, which we'll get to. But anyway, Wernher von Braun would be down for every launch up there in the second floor of the blockhouse with us. And he would be sitting at a row of consoles where the launch director, and sitting right next to him was the designer of the Complex 39 called Dr. Kurt Debus. And they always sat right next to each other. They were both from Peenemünde, from the original Peenemünde team that we brought over. And they had two periscopes always built in to the blockhouses, one for Wernher von Braun to look through, to look out to the pad, to watch the rocket when it was launching and so forth, and other aspects, and another one for Dr. Kurt Debus. And when they would close the door during the final hours of the countdown, a big 12-inch thick steel door, it was in the back of the blockhouse there, away from the pad. It was only 1,000 feet to the pad over in pad 37 on the Cape Canaveral side. There was only one bathroom in the second floor. And for all of us, when we lock up that door, we could be in there for hours. So there was always a line for that one bathroom. And I was in that line more than once, but there was one time I was in the line, and I remembered people used to get up from their console with their launch countdown procedure. They would always have a nice picture of, the Saturn going off or something, and they would go over and get Wernher von Braun's signature and Kurt Debus. And I said, "What are you doing?" We're going over there getting his signature. I'm not going to bother him. I'm not. But anyway, and I never did, and I'm sorry I didn't, because a lot of these people got their signatures on almost all the countdown procedures we had, the 4 or 5 of them there, over a period of time. But anyway, I'm in line there, and who comes up behind me? Wernher von Braun. And this guy is bigger than life to me, because I'm a punk kid out of Georgia Tech. And anyway, a console operator, the instrumentation console, and I wanted to say something to him. I just wanted to, and I was trying to think, like, what am I going to? So I turned around to him and I says, "Dr. von Braun, would you like to go ahead of me?" And he says, No, I take my turn." But I was able to say those words to him. That's all I could think of.
That's so great.
And sure enough, I turned around and I was sweating and I was kind of blushing. But that was my interface, that one and only ever, get close to him and actually talking to him and having a response from him.
Oh man, it's like
no,
Peter.
I take my turn.
It's like Peter on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus and Moses and Elijah. He's like, I don't know what to say.
And he had that strong German accent. No, I take my turn.
That's so great.
Quite a guy.
So neat. So the Apollo program, I think, not even arguably, I think one of the greatest achievements of mankind. And
absolutely
right. This was really just about 50 years ago that this happened.
In 2 years, it'll be 50 years ago exactly. Yes. Yeah. In July.
And you were there.
Yes.
You were a part of this.
I was in the firing room.
Yep. In the firing. What was that like?
That's well.
And you got your firing badge too. You want to show your badge?
Yeah, I show my badge. I guess we ought to talk about the Apollo 1 fire. I was in blockhouse 34 during that time.
Yeah.
And we were running a plugs out OAT over there, and it was really called AS-204, and they eventually called it Apollo 1, which would be the first manned mission on the Apollo-built capsule that would hold 3 people. Okay. The Mercury held 1 person, the Gemini capsule held 2, and this was the first one that would hold 3 astronauts.
Oh, wow.
And we know most everybody knows that story. We had the fire in the spacecraft, and that's what we had when we had our headsets on. We heard over the network, fire in the spacecraft,
Mm-hmm.
And we had all these different channels on these turnstiles that you could switch over to the spacecraft channel, launch operation channel, or whatever. And I immediately switched over. We all did, to hear this absolute chaos going on. And a fire had broken out in the capsule, and there was 100% oxygen atmosphere in there, and it only took a spark. Gus Grissom was the commander sitting in the left chair, and Ed White, who was the first person to ever walk in space in one of the Gemini missions, did a spacewalk. And Roger Chaffee was the youngest one sitting on the right-hand couch there. When they had built that to NASA specifications, the North American Aviation got the original contract, and North American Aviation eventually became Rockwell, North American Rockwell, and then eventually dropped off North American and became Rockwell International. They had built the spacecraft to NASA specifications. The spacecraft door where they did ingress and egress going into and out of, they had designed that door to open inward, because they always had 5 psi of pressure always on the inside of the spacecraft with the pure oxygen atmosphere in there. And it took about 90 seconds for them to do the preparation to open the door inward. When we had the fire, it was a horrible experience for all of us, and it made a definite impression on us. And I thought it was the end of the space program when we did have that horrible tragedy. And they died a fiery death in there, but it didn't take long because the temperature in there was 2,000 degrees. I think I heard something in a matter of seconds, and so it was quick. But we did hear the screams of I think it was Roger Chaffee saying, "Get us out of here," or something like that. And it was about 6:30 in the evening, and I think it was on a Friday too. The plugs out, what they call overall test, was where you actually you undo the umbilicals, and you start a timer. You start simulating that they're an actual mission, fake the battery, going to internal power and all that. And that's the test we were running. And that was, I would say, the low point of all of us that were working in the space program, was that a fire where they had met with a tragic death. So for, I think, about 20 months, sat back. A lot of us waited for our papers to, hey, end the program. We never got them. 20 months later, they said, hey, we've redesigned the door to the spacecraft. The command module is what we called it, that housed the 3 astronauts, and you can open it in 5 seconds. You don't open it inward anymore. It opens outward. And not only that, by the way, we've changed the atmosphere to 40% nitrogen and 60% oxygen for ground testing, much safer environment for ground tests. They eventually switched to oxygen, pure oxygen, on their way to the moon and everything. Anyway, that was, it took 20 months for that redesign to happen. First launch of that spacecraft, that redesigned door and everything, was Apollo 7 with Wally Schirra. And it was just a suborbital flight to just say, hey, how is this thing working? It was the very first flight of the 3-person command module was Apollo 7. And then switching over to, and the Apollo on the Cape Canaveral side, called the Saturn 1B vehicle, was only, here again, low Earth orbit. Yeah. But you would gain a lot of information that you needed for going to the moon, because a lot of those pieces you were going to be using, especially our stage, as the 3rd stage of the moon rocket. So we were gathering a lot of, there was a feasibility study that every time you launch one of those 2-stage rockets, we launched 3 or 4 of them over there, mostly unmanned, but with the first manned one. And then we transitioned over to the Saturn V, the gigantic moon rocket, to work over there. And we'll pick it up from there.
Yeah. Well, tell me real quick about, I know that the deaths of those 3 men, that impacted you significantly.
Did.
Tell us what that did to you.
Well, in America, we wear heart on our shirt sleeve, so to speak. This country, everything that's going on in space. It's on the news. It's you got cameras, everything. Unlike Russia, who was very secretive, and they had some major incidents over there. A lot of people died with explosions on the pad, but you never heard about them until later when we became friendly with them. Mm-hmm. It was, the whole world knew what we had done, and it was a terrifying experience by fire, the horrible thing. When you put a human being on a rocket, flying in space is extremely risky and dangerous. Right. There's so many parts and everything. We're talking millions of parts that have to work, most of them perfectly, and and a lot of the systems that are very critical. You design things where if one of these things fail, you got another one or two for it. It's called redundancy. And you have dual redundancy where one could fail and another one would take over and it can still save you. And eventually on the shuttle, we got to quad redundancy in the flight control system where you could have, a failure you'd have to have a failure 3 deep or something like that before you had a major catastrophe. So, and that's how we would, for manned, I say manned, I say as people, when you're flying people on these missions, it's the utmost that you can take to make sure that they live, that nothing happens, that you do the best you can. But there's always that possibility. So my point is, flying in space is very risky business, and that's why we're getting ready to, have somebody in our country developing a capability for us to fly in space again, because we've been having to depend on the Russians for the last 6 years and paying them very expensive bills every time we put an American in one of their seats in their Soyuz spacecraft to go to our International Space Station. I say ours. It's international, belongs to 15 countries.
Right.
But anyway, I got sideswiped there. Yeah. Go ahead. We're getting back to Firing Room 1 on Complex 39 where we launched the moon mission.
Yeah. So what was that like? Being a part of that history.
We like I said, we're after the fire. A lot of us waited for and that was January 27th, 1967, about 6:30 p.m. When that fire happened, that tragic.
And you thought
fire.
It was all over.
And we thought it was all over. And we remember the date, January 1967. And for 20 months, we kind of sat on our fingers and we studied and we wrote more procedures because we were getting ready to start testing the Saturn V, which is the moon rocket that could get you to the moon, the 3-stage vehicle instead of a 2-stage vehicle, 3 rockets instead of 2. We spent the time. They got the command module redesigned. They had a very successful flight with Wally Schirra with that command module, showing the viability of, hey, it works good, and it comes back in okay. The heat shield held up very well because the heat of reentry is horrendous. So the Saturn V, we kept going. But the very first Saturns that we launched 2 that were without crew, without human beings on them. The massive, the 501, they call it Apollo. The mission application was Apollo 4, was the very first Saturn V moon rocket. At the last 3 minutes and 7 seconds, you go on what they call automatic sequence, where the computer has to, open valves and close this and do the various functions, turning this on, turning that off, whatever. And you can leave your chair in the firing room and run out. And I ran out and over in front of the VAB of that first Saturn V that was lifting off. I said, it'll never fly. It's too big. And it's 363 feet tall. And it's massive. And when you're, especially in the VAB, when you're all the way up there at the 360-foot level looking down and the platforms are pulled away, you'd say, holy, this will never get off the ground.
Oh, man.
But I ran out and I to witness it, and there was a crowd out there. Oh, yeah. And that thing, it lifted off 3, 2, 1. The engines, it takes so long for the engine to get up to speed. The F1 engines on the first stage, they light them they start the engine sequence about 9 seconds before actual T0, before they release the hold down arms to let it go. It takes that long for those great big massive 7.5 million 5 engines at 1.5 million pounds of thrust apiece to get up to thrust level before and as soon as they get up to 90% thrust, which I call main stage, they release the arms and the way you go. And I had on this. When you were in the launch team, they make you wear these white shirts. They were man-made material. That you could wash them and they wouldn't wrinkle or anything like that. That was back. I've forgotten what kind of material they called them, but all of us had them. That thing took off so slowly and cleared the pad, and it kept on going. And the wind was blowing directly back into us. A very strong wind, right? And it's 3 miles away. We're 3 miles from the VAB and the firing rooms to the launch pad where it actually happens. And there was reason for that, because if you ever had an explosion on the pad, It was so many thousands of tons of TNT going off. That's why the firing room was so far away from the pad, the launch pad. But anyway, this black cloud, kind of a grayish black cloud was blowing in toward us. And the next thing you know, it's kind of like raining, and I'm seeing these little black specks getting all over my shirt here. So it's from the RP-1 fuel that was burned with the liquid oxygen. And it was some sort of carbon stuff. But let me tell you, everybody that was outside during that first launch of that Saturn V had these black specks all over from that blew right in from the ocean. But that thing kept on going very slow off the pad. It took about 12 or 13 seconds just to clear the 400 feet of the launch tower and going up in it. But, it's using up 30,000 pounds of propellant per second.
Oh, my goodness.
Ingesting into those 5 engines. So the weight of that first stage becomes very light because it's you're using so much fuel. And as the mass decreases, your acceleration starts up. And by the time you're going 2.5 minutes later, that whole big mammoth thing is going 6,000 miles an hour just for the first stage. But we'll talk about the other stages But that was the very first one. That was unmanned. But there was a second one that was unmanned. We had some problems called POGO with that, where we had this 12-cycle oscillation that it was so bad that, even the astronauts, it would have harmed the astronauts. And they solved that with accumulators and LOX lines or something like that. And we lost, there were a couple of engine failures on that mission. But the very next one, guess what? Called Apollo 8, we're going to the moon. So the third mission, we had human beings on it. And Apollo 8 was the moon mission, the very first moon mission, where the astronauts went up there. A couple of them read verses out of the Bible and made that atheist here on Earth, Madeline Mary O'Hare, or whatever her name, she went berserk. How dare you read the Bible quotes? This really happened. Something happened to her too later on, but that was really a spiritual event when they went around the moon. They saw moonrise and all that stuff. That was the first moon mission. But and then we went on from there. There was other development missions with the 3-stage massive Saturn V, and then eventually, what I want to get to is the most exhilarating moment of my entire career. After that low point of the fire in '67, here it's July of '69, July 16th. I'll never forget the date. About 9:32 in the morning or something like that. And we're lifting off, and we're going to the moon, that first moon mission. The firing room was packed with dignitaries and people. It was amazing. And over in Titusville, they said there was over 1 million people here for that viewing. Nobody could use US-1. They were over J.C. Penney's. There was a big mall over there. And it was covered with protoplasm people, and nobody could get through if they were going to Miami or something. Waiting for that launch. It was the most exciting and exhilarating moment of my life. So we went from a low point in '67, and here 2.5 years later, we're on our way to the moon. It's almost unbelievable. And after the fire, major tragedy, as that thing lifted off, I think everybody had chill bumps. We're going to the moon? Are you kidding me? But there's still people out there, the non-believers, everything was NASA simulation and so forth like that. And I hate to tell you, you're wrong. I was there. They did make it. They walked on the moon. There were a couple of serious problems that nobody ever heard about that were going on as Armstrong and Aldrin were coming down to the moon. They had a major glitch in one of the computers, and that was one thing. And there was some guy that said, "Hey, do this thing, punch in, blah blah blah," and it fixed it. It reset the computer as they were coming down. And as they were coming down, they were doing an auto approach. The Eigen system, the AG system they would call it, was bringing them down to their landing site. And they look out the window, and Armstrong says, "Holy mackerel, we're getting ready to land on the side of a crater."
Oh, wow.
And he took over at that particular moment in time, and you could fly it by remote control, this hand controller. And he took over that thing and started flying it, looking for a landing, because The engine on the descent module portion of that lunar module that landed, it was a two-stage vehicle, a descent module that allowed you to land, and then it became a launch platform. And then there was the second piece was that the ascent module that had the two astronauts in it that could take off to come back to rendezvous, and you left the descent stage on the moon. So there's 6 of them up there, what they call the descent stages. But anyway, as Armstrong saw that, hey, this ain't going to work, because they had landed on it, the whole thing might have tipped over. And it looked just like a bug. It didn't have to be aerodynamic because there's no atmosphere to worry about. Right. But it was an ugly looking thing, but it worked perfectly. Yeah. And as it became a lifeboat, an Apollo 13 mission, as you saw, if you saw the movie, and that really did save their lives. But he took over flying that thing as he got to a place where he thought it was okay to settle down because they didn't know what was going to happen. First moon landing. As you get down so close, there's a switch that shuts off the descent engine. And they only had, I think it was several seconds of fuel left, is all they had left for him to fly that. Goodness. And that descent engine is a variable thrust engine. You can vary the thrust from 1,000 pounds to 10,000, but you had to be able to do that, to be able to maneuver that descent stage coming in for a landing. And all of the descent stages had that variable it's called throttleable engine, when you can, change the thrust from 1,000 pounds to up to 10,000 pounds. That's called throttleable. Most engines are not throttleable. You light them, you start them, and they go, and they give you that thrust, 200,000 pounds or whatever it is, steady. Now you can change that a little bit with mixture ratio valve on the LOX side, liquid oxygen system. I'm getting too a little bit technical here, but basically most engines are not throttleable. The SSMEs on the shuttle were throttleable. You could actually take them from 104% down to 60%, which is what they always did, and then you throttle back up. And why did you do that? Because the maximum dynamic pressure, called max Q, would build up on the vehicle, and to minimize that, they would bring the thrust down to slow the thing down a little bit to get through that max Q. And as soon as you're through that max Q very rapidly, then you throttle back up again. So the shuttle engines were throttleable on the shuttle. Here again, I'm getting sidetracked again, but I'm all over the place because working on all these programs.
Yeah,
the vessel 50 some odd years. Yeah,
the vessel they were in is called a shuttle that landed on the moon.
That's right.
Yeah.
No. Okay. What landed on the moon was a lunar module.
The lunar module. Okay.
The lunar module,
right.
And it was made by Grumman.
Okay.
Up in New York, and it was really a very ugly looking vehicle. It's not aerodynamic in any way.
It didn't have to be.
Yeah. But it was an amazing. It was a very amazing machine, and it worked perfectly for the mission.
So the thing I'd like to talk about right now is just the feat behind actually accomplishing this. I mean, I'm astounded because we have the technology we have, like the phone in my pocket right now has over 120 million times the speed that the capability and speed and processing power
computers in the Saturn
than the computer that sent a manned rocket to the moon.
That's exactly correct.
And you guys, you guys working on this important mission, this legendary mission that changed history, quite literally. This was done with a paper, a pencil, and a slide rule, and some really smart brains, essentially.
That's
right,
correct.
And some very slow processing computing power.
Yes.
How in the world was that possible?
That is
how. Talk about that.
That is a question that I have been asked more than once. And it's a very good question because people are amazed. You did this in less than 10 years? Somebody made a speech about going to the moon and back in less than 10 years, and you did it from scratch. Well, it wasn't from scratch.
Yeah.
There were major pieces that had already been in development by Huntsville on the Saturn program. It was not new. The Saturn 1 had been in development since 58 or 59. The F1 engines on the first stage booster had been in development by the Air Force, and they turned it over, I think it was to NASA, and for them they had a lot of problems with the development of that, but they finally got them all ironed out. But when you talk about 1960s technology, is basically where we were still in the slide rule era, because when I graduated from Georgia Tech, everybody had what we called a slip stick, and we had this belt loop that, and everybody on that campus had one of those things swinging on their body, on the side of their body, and that was your lifeline, was that little slip stick. And there used to be there stories about, when you go into a quiz, you better take out a bucket of water with you. And some of these professors, because you're going to have to put that dipstick in a bucket of water to cool it down, because you're going back. Mine was made out of bamboo by Post Versalog, and I still have it. But eventually, later on, a guy by the name of Bill Hewlett of Hewlett Packard, David Packard, Bill Hewlett. This Bill Hewlett was the guy that got everybody together, all of his engineers, one day in the early 70s, and brought them into a room and said, I want you to build me a calculator that'll do all these functions. He put all these trigonometric, geometric, logarithm, base 10, natural log, everything there. And his designers said, hey, that's not a problem. He says, I'm not through. What else is it? The machine that you're going to build me, we're going to call it a calculator, and it's got to fit in this pocket right here. And they said, no way. Oh, yeah? We're going to do it. And we got the HP 35 was the first, and it was called Shirt Pocket Power. Shirt Pocket Power, I should say. And I still have the article by Bill Hewlett. It was an IEEE magazine or something like that with his picture on the front. And that was the beginning of calculators as we knew it. And they had the first mortgage on it because Bill Hewlett developed that thing. It had in the natural log of E, in the 10th place, the number wasn't right or something like that, but the thing was amazing. Then it used reverse Polish notation, where it was just kind of the reverse how you normally would use a calculator. But I bought one, $399. They took it out of my check. Took me a year to pay for it. Everybody got on the bandwagon with one of those things. So essentially, we were now getting out of the realm of the slipstick. But even when I graduated from Tech, they were just starting to introduce digital calculators. They were having courses in digital calculators because a lot of people were still using analog computers. Okay. And I say calculators, I say digital computers.
Yeah, and computers back then were about the size of a car, right?
Yes, yeah. The ones on the ground. But, if you were going to fly something, you had to miniaturize it. And that was another sidebar real quick. They wanted cameras to take on the moon for the very first moon mission. Mm-hmm. And all of the TV cameras at that particular time were on these tripods, and they weighed 250. They were massive. If you ever saw them in the old 1950s and 60s rooms where they had them rolling around, they were massive. Yeah. NASA said they went to RCA and they said, "Hey, we want some cameras to put on the moon when we make it, and they can't be 250 pounds."
Right.
So the very first minicam was developed by RCA. They're up there on the moon today. And when you saw Armstrong coming down the ladder, those were cameras developed by RCA. They weren't the miniature ones you got, the micro miniature ones you got now that are, cubes. Yeah. Right. But RCA did it. They miniaturized TV cameras, and they were also color. They made them in color, too. It's amazing. That's a sidebar.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But they're up there on the moon to this day. They left them up there.
Wow.
Where I diversed.
Yeah, so what's... you touched on it a little bit, but what was your role in these missions, particularly like the moon missions?
The moon mission, I think I told you, I was assigned to the measuring systems for the transducers that gave you the temperatures and the pressures and so forth. That's what they were called, transducers that measure these things. But how do you get them to the ground? Well, you get them to the ground through a telemetry system. Well, it goes into a telemetry system that's still on board, but how do you get them to the ground? Well, you go to a transmitter that's a radio frequency transmitter that's like an FM transmitter that transmits voice and music and all. It's the similar thing. Mm-hmm. And you put it on a carrier, and you take the output of that transmitter with this information on it, modulate it onto the carrier, and it goes through an antenna. Just like, we have antennas today, and it's directed toward the ground. They have ground stations all over the world that can receive this RF signal, and they demodulate that signal, and here's the intelligence on the ground that is coming from the vehicle.
Yeah.
And that's how you determine essentially the health and welfare of your system or your subsystem or the engine system or the propellant utilization system or the guidance computer. How you determine that was through this telemetry. Very important system.
Oh, yeah. A lot of moving parts, right?
Well, you lose that system, and I mean, you have no visibility whatsoever on the ground. The people that are controlling a mission or something like that, they are dependent on those displays that they have. They're coming through space, just like I told you. The measurement picks up the physical action, either a pressure or a temperature or a flow rate or something like that, and that's how it gets to the ground. And without that, you have no idea what's going on in that vehicle. So it's very important that the telemetry system, the measuring system, and the RF, the radio frequency system, the RF system that transmits that to the ground over a carrier. Some now they're in gigahertz, but back in the Saturn days, they were megahertz. 250, 260 megahertz carriers that would send the information to the ground. But that's how we did it. That was one of my systems. The J2 engine, which was an amazing thing, was another system that I learned from my friend that was here last night, Dick Carlson.
Yeah.
Very, very, he was called Mr. S4B. And he was my mentor, and he taught me everything I ever wanted to know about the J2 engine, how it operated, because I had to write a procedure to capture on a very high-speed recorder the valve timing, because once you start the engine, all of these valves, the liquid hydrogen valve, the liquid oxygen valve, and all these valves, the gas generator valve, all these valves had a certain sequence that it would go through. And the timing on especially the second stage of the main oxidizer valve opening would have to be 1,525 milliseconds plus or minus so many milliseconds. And if you weren't there, they would change an orifice out on the stage on the engine itself and keep changing the orifices till they could get in that exact band, which was a specification. I had to write the procedure for that. Oh, wow. And so that was another system that I inherited, and I learned how it worked from the very point of giving engine start command all the way through to main stage where it got up to 90% thrust. I'm glad I learned that because I had a quest for knowledge. There were people, engineers that would say, this is my system. I go from here to here, and I don't care what's going on from there to here. I was a little bit different, and it really helped me in my career of saying, hey, well, after you leave here, where does it go? Does it go up the command module? Right. And it coming up here to us, this interface, what's happening down here? I always would do research on that. How do you control things from when you're sitting at a console and you flip a switch to turn something on? How does it go from that switch all the way out 3 miles out to the mobile launcher into the stage? Dick Carlson helped me with that. That gentleman that I've known for 50 years. And you have two. You didn't know it. We used to swim in their pool up in Titusville.
It was great to see him last night.
Very, very highly knowledgeable man and very highly respected by the NASA people. Every time they would get a problem in the loading system, and the loading system was tremendous. And getting back to your how did all of this happen? Yeah, there was so much, because it wasn't just building the vehicle and the intricacies of building a rocket to the moon and all of the systems and the millions and millions of parts that had to be developed all over the country. We're talking 400,000 people were involved in this system, and about 30,000 of us were out here that were the culmination of all of their fruits of their labor. Wound up with us, pressing the button not pressing the button, but the computer would launch the thing after we checked it out and made sure everything worked. There was 30,000 of us here. The other 370,000 were responsible all over this country. And what I'm proud to say about that is that every single piece down to the minute chip, or we didn't really have chips. We had transistors back then mostly. Mm-hmm. Everything was built in the good old USA, made in America, the entire Saturn V launch vehicle that took us to the moon and back. Wow. And we're talking millions and millions of pieces and parts. You could not do that today.
No.
It's called, we have to go around the world and say, hey, can we get chips from you, China? And can we get you from some other country, whatever? We would not. It would be difficult to do that today. Now, NASA is working on their new rocket, that's going to be very similar, actually more powerful than the Saturn V, but they haven't done it yet. So the Saturn V rocket that took us to the moon and back is still the greatest, most powerful rocket ever developed, with a slide rule and with a team of 400,000 people, of which I was extremely fortunate to have been in the right place at the right time and the right age, to be exact, because I just turned 80 years old. But I had 51 years out there, from the missiles to the last launch of the shuttle. And we're in a new era now, and we're like you said, when I bought her that iPhone, it can fit in her back pocket. All these ladies slip them in their back pocket. That has more power. I don't know about 120 million Saturns that it could fly. I don't know about that number, but I know that the computer power that we had available at that particular time was enough to make the moon mission. But we're not talking megabytes; we're talking kilobytes. 125. I think even the memory on the shuttle computers that we fly, we had 5 of them, IBM computers that flew the shuttle, 4 together and 1 by itself, had 128K of memory, and they finally. I think they finally doubled it to 256K. They had a little problem when they did that with a software that had been developed for the 128K, but that was another thing, another problem, minor. And but the question is so colossal, because so many people. When I'm out there on my days of docent duty, and I had to find out what docent meant. It means volunteer. DOCNENT. They asked me that question because when they come in and they come out of what they said was the firing room where we all sat to launch the thing, they got one, and then you open up the doors and come out of that simulated firing room. They say this is exact replica of the firing room that we launched the thing. Well, they're missing 2 rows of consoles in the back, but it's pretty close. They did salvage a whole bunch of the consoles that we originally used back in the Saturn days 50 years ago, and it's great. And then you walk out and you walk out into this room that this huge museum, and you walk out under these F1 engines, 5 F1 engines with 1.5 million pounds of thrust, and you're looking at a 33-foot diameter rocket here. Wow. And people said it didn't look that big on TV. It looks like a pencil. When it's taken off, and that's what most people ever. But when they walk out of that room for the next phase of into the main where I work, I say I work, I go out there and answer questions a couple of times a month. They ask that question, how did you do this? How in 60, you were still using slide rules, weren't you? Yes, we were. And but that's a hard question to answer, because it's so big, the technology of the time. With what we did with that technology, the older I get, the more in awe I am of what we did. But when I was working on that thing, as a young guy, and all of us were, it was a job. I didn't have the perception of what in the world are we really doing? How did we get these massive pieces of hardware here? How did they build it in this record time? How did they, how?
How did everybody synchronize? All these moving parts.
There's so many pieces and so many parts, and they had to work together.
Had to be in harmony.
And the one thing that was very interesting is the whole rocket was designed by Wernher von Braun and his team, and Arthur Rudolph was the other guy who was a major player. I remember the Peenemünde people from Germany. They came up with the design of this massive thing, and then they said, okay, this is going to be a 3-stage booster. The first stage, here's the plans. Boeing, we're going to give you build the first stage, called the S1C stage. Hey, North American Aviation, you build the second stage. Here's the plans of our rocket. Hey, Douglas Aircraft, you build the third stage called the S4B. And here's our plans. And hey, IBM, you build the IU that's going to be the brains of this whole thing. It's a little 3-foot ring that had an IBM computer in it and the stable table for the platform that you set up that would detect where you were in space with these gyros and accelerometers and so forth. And then, Grumman, we're going to have you build the lunar module, that's going to land on the moon, build a 2-stage vehicle. And, we're going to go back to North American Aviation. You build a service module that's going to house the engine. And, by the way, build the command module as well that's going to have the 3 people in it. So North American Aviation built the engines with a subsidiary called Rocketdyne that was a part of the North American Aviation. They built the rocket engines for the first stage, called the F1 engines, the 7.5 million pounds of thrust. They built the J2 engine systems that were used on the second stage, and they built the J2 engine used on the third stage, which is what I worked on. And the difference between the one that they used on the 2-stage vehicle, that J2 engine, and the J2 engine they used on the moon mission, we had a restartable engine because we had to restart our engine. You got this 260,000 pounds in orbit, and that's a lot of weight in what we call a circular parking orbit for a couple of revs there with our first burn. And you go from 0 to 17,400 miles an hour in 11.5 minutes with this 3-stage vehicle, each one burning up to depletion. All the fellas that are bleeding the first stage, it drops away. Second stage is lit, gets you up. Now you get to 6,000 miles an hour with that massive first stage burn, pushing all of that weight. And then the second stage takes over. And it's got 1 million pounds of thrust, and it gets you up to 15,000 miles an hour, but you're 2,000 miles shy of having enough velocity to stay in orbit around the Earth. So our stage has to light up and burn for a couple of minutes to get you that delta V, the velocity make up that 2,000 miles an hour to get you in orbit. And then we shut our engine down. Now, while you're in that parking orbit, NASA is checking out all of the systems on the entire stack. Because the spacecraft really, when you call it a spacecraft, it's a singular noun, but it really entails the command module with the 3 astronauts in it. Right underneath it is a service module that has the engine that's going to do your mid-course corrections on the way out there and also slow you down so you can get into orbit around the moon and also fire back up so you can come back to Earth. And that's called the service module. And then underneath that is the lunar module. Now, when you put those 3 pieces together, you kind of refer to them that's the spacecraft.
Okay.
3 pieces, not just the little command module. But and then underneath that, of course, is the booster, which I just told you about. But after we're in orbit for 2.5 revs, and NASA says we're go for TLI, that's what you wait on. Well, what's TLI mean? Trans-lunar injection. You're ready to start our engine again. So everything has to get ready to start our engine again. Now we got to burn, get us out of orbit, start burning toward the moon. That's what they call TLI. And we burn for about 6 minutes because you have to get from 17,000 miles an hour to 25,000 miles an hour to escape the 1G pull on you, Earth's gravitational pull.
You want to talk about the shuttle, the space shuttle?
We can do that now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about the space shuttle because that was the next mission right after the moon missions.
After Apollo was over.
What was the space shuttle mission for?
The space shuttle mission was designed. NASA convinced the Congress and the people that they needed a reusable system because when you launched the massive Saturn V rocket, you had a $500 million mission back in 1960 or $60 and so forth, which would be billions now today. You throw away the rocket, and NASA came up with a slicker word than saying a throwaway. They call it expendable. So when you say expendable, that means you use this rocket and it drops in the ocean and sinks and you don't recover it. And then another rocket, the second stage, maybe takes off and it drops farther down in the ocean and you don't recover it. And in the Saturn era, you started off with this massive 363 feet tall thing 63 feet longer than a football field rocket, and the only thing that came back from that mission was this little tiny thing on the top called the command module with the 3 astronauts in it. That's the only thing that came back. Everything else was wasted. So after NASA, space systems are very expensive, and only up to now, only the federal government had been able to, finance these large projects. So NASA convinced, they came up with the concept of the shuttle, and it was called the shuttle. Basically, was called a space transportation system. This would be essentially, I called it a space truck. Could not do anything but go in Earth orbit. The design limitations were that it would have a payload bay 60 feet long and 15 feet in diameter, and could take a payload weight of about up to 60,000 pounds into low Earth orbit. But highly maneuverable, but the most complex machine in the history of the world. Why was it so complex, so much more complex than the Saturn? Because to have a reusable system, you have to have a system that you can get back and use it again. That's the definition of reusable. Right. So what they did was they built the shuttle design. Basically, was 3 things rolled into one structure: a rocket to get you into space, an absolute rocket with 3 space shuttle main engines on the back of it, and of course the boosters that are thrown away. But the space shuttle main engines get you into orbit. And then you have these OMS pods on the back of it that give you the manipulation in orbit for various attitudes. And you have these reaction control jets all over it to do all kinds of anything you wanted to do with the joystick in the cockpit up in the flight deck. And this system was a rocket going into space. It was a spacecraft, number 2. Spacecraft where astronauts actually could live, like in the command module, right. Space. And what was the third thing? Oh, you want to bring it back home? And make it an airplane, a lifting body, essentially.
Okay.
3 things in one.
Yeah.
So the complexity of having 3 things in one is going to be, it had to be all computerized. I mean, everything controlled by computers. And they selected IBM as a contractor. And I've forgotten what the number on their computer was, but they built them, they programmed them. The 4 of them they programmed, and Draper Labs and Rockwell programmed the other one. They never talked to each other about how to fly and control these 26 data buses that they would control the whole vehicle with through these computers. And 4 of them would work as a redundant set, and then after you got on orbit, then you split them up. One would do station, keep you on station and that proper attitude. Another would do health and welfare. You could split them up, and you had one if you're going up or coming down. That if those 4 ever got out of sync, those 4 computers, they had a button on the joystick in the flight deck that the astronauts could push. Either one of them could push it. It would engage the BFS, called the backup flight system, and that one computer would fly the whole vehicle, either going up or coming down. That was center entry. But we did have we had 2 major malfunctions during that program.
Real quick before you get to that, who designed the space shuttle? It wasn't Wernher von Braun.
No,
right?
no, it was not Wernher von Braun.
Passed away by then.
It was a NASA design agency out of Houston and Marshall, and it was the contract was won by Rockwell International, 1972. Wow. So we were still in the Apollo phase program, going through the Skylab missions during that period of time, and that was another after the Saturn V, the last Saturn V launch in December of '72, Apollo 17. that the last three Saturn boosters were canceled, but they had already built them. So they used one of them to put up Skylab, and they had 3 missions to that space station. It was a space station. The first one we ever put up in May of '73, with 2 stages of a Saturn V rocket. And the third stage was where our S4B was, but they converted it to what they call an orbital workshop, what they call Skylab. And then we had 3 crews go to that. After that, we had one more mission called Apollo-Soyuz, where we went up and we kissed the Russians in space. And we learned, you talk about a technology swap there, where we joined up with them. I think it was Nixon arranged that during his administration, to have that mission with the Russians, and we were kind of melting the ice with them then. And they got a lot more technology out of that program than we did, because they were still using vacuum tubes and stuff like. I'm being a little bit facetious, but our technology had passed them tremendously, which we found out by joining with them.
Was that like maybe the first time
It was, yeah. It was, and it was, the mission was called Apollo-Soyuz. It was July of '75, and that was the last Apollo mission. Of course, the moon missions were over in '72, like I said, December '72, and we still had two Saturn V's left, and so I get to go out to, one of them is out here at Kennedy Space Center at the museum. I highly recommend people to come down here and go through that. It's an amazing $57 or $58 for a bus ticket.
Yeah, and you might even bump into Jimbo
you bump
here.
into me if you're out there on a Tuesday, the first or third Tuesday of every month, sitting over there by the model of the Saturn V in that museum, and it's called the Apollo Saturn V Center, and they use a Roman numeral, for the 5.
This is the Kennedy Space Center.
At the Kennedy Space Center, but anyway, but not only is that, they have the rocket garden there where you take the bus out of to come over to the Space Center and buy the VAB, and they show you the crawler, and it's a very informative. The Americans would see where their tax dollars went back in years, and what they're going to now. They're showing you the new mobile launcher that they're designing there for the space launch system. They're calling the new system. But anyway, getting back to the shuttle.
Yeah.
We started off with STS-1, which I have my badge that allowed me in the firing room access. It says STS-1 on it. That was April of 1981, and I kept that one as a historic a piece of history for my archives. And I didn't talk about the one I kept for Apollo 11, which has the Apollo 11 down here. That allowed me to go into the firing room, sit at the console, go in and out, and it says permanent firing room access on it. And each one of these badges they would give you for a new mission, it says Apollo 11 right there. And this is really a keepsake. I kept that one as the only one. I should have kept them all for all the moon missions, but anyway. And then there was another badge that allowed me to get on if I had to ever go out to the pad and work on a system or troubleshoot something out there, this badge allowed me to go out there and have access to the pad. And this is another badge that I had. It was taken in April 1960 when I was working for Douglas Aircraft on the Thor vehicle. It had your mugshot on it. It says McDonnell Douglas on there. McDonnell wound up buying Douglas in 1967, and we became McDonnell Douglas. And that's why that's on there. But I started, this was when I was with Douglas. But the shuttle, we started off with the STS-1. And it was sequential until for the first couple of years when we were the people that built it. It was Rockwell, the company I was with. They built all 5 of the shuttles, Rockwell International. They got, like I told you, got the contract, 72, built them all. We were supposed to fly the first one in 79, but the tiles kept falling off that were supposed to protect us from, reentry, for the heat of reentry. So they had to do all this pulling off every single tile, 33,000 of them, and sticking them back on with a new procedure to where they wouldn't fall off, because if those tile fell off, they were made out of sand, you would burn a hole in there, because you're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit when you're coming back in. It'd burn a hole through the skin of the vehicle very rapidly. So we were supposed to launch in 79. We didn't launch till April of 81. And the very first launch of that shuttle, And unlike the Saturn, where we had 2 launches without people on top to test the system, Shuttle, first launch, we had to put 2 people in it.
Why did we do that?
John, because you had to have manual systems in there that somebody had to turn this on, turn that off. It wasn't totally automated.
So there's a pretty great risk from
pretty
launch
great
one.
risk. And they picked John Young and Bob Crippen to be that first crew. And let me tell you, so on a very first launch on a system like that, where it's the most complicated beast to fly into space ever, it really took some doing, some guts. And John Young had the guts, and he also he had walked on the moon. He was one of the moon mission commanders as well.
Wow.
I think of Apollo 16. And but anyway. So we had the first flight, and it was successful. And when John Young came down that ladder, when it landed out in California, it was only I think a 2-day or 3-day something. It was a very short mission because it was the first one. He was so excited, and I don't know whether he was excited because he was still alive, but I mean he was proud. And Bob Crippen was very, very familiar with the flight software that controlled the whole thing. But then we went on from there, and we lost the contract on STS-10. We lost the contract to launch them, even though we built the vehicle. And the vehicle, when we call it a shuttle, it's not really a shuttle until you take the piece that Rockwell built, which was called an orbiter vehicle, an OV, and it would have a tail number, OV 102, OV 99, OV this, OV that. And so Challenger, that we're going to talk about real quickly, was OV 99. And it was kind of out of sequence because the Columbia vehicle that we lost later on was OV 102. But you take an orbiter vehicle, and you take a right SRB and a left SRB, solid rocket boosters, and an external tank made by Lockheed Martin. The boosters were made by Morton Thiokol and in Utah, and put together, four segments on each one of them. When you strapped all of this together, it became a space shuttle. But the piece that comes back with the 7 people in is called the orbiter vehicle. But everybody still, they still refer to it as, the space shuttle. Well, let's go out and see the space shuttle. Well, it's the Atlantis. It's out here on display. They built a $100 million building to put it on display. NASA did. It's a beautiful, they got it tilted at, with an angle, and it had flown, I've forgotten how many million miles in space and how many missions, but it's an orbiter vehicle, and it's part of the shuttle. But when you talk about the program was called Space Transportation System, hence the letters STS on every mission. Space Transportation System, mission number 1, flight 1. Now, after we lost the contract to Lockheed to launch it, and we were sent on our way, Lockheed took over. 2 years after that, we had the Challenger incident, and there was a brigadier general that had come in to work with Lockheed, and he renamed the systems to something else, some coding fancy thing that he came up with. So instead of the Challenger mission that we lost in January of 1986, it was 51L. It was mission 51L that this general had come up with. As soon as the general left, NASA said, we're going back to the mission numbers again. And so hence STS-135 was the last mission, because it was a sequence.
Launches,
But there was several missions there that this general had come up with, and there was some sort of fancy coding as to whether it was launched here or over on the West Coast out there at Vandenberg, and that eventually, but Challenger was not STS-25 or 26; it was 51L. So that's what you'll always read about, Challenger, the 51L incident. But then after Challenger. After the Challenger mission and a few of those odd coded things that the general made, NASA went back to the numbering system again, which I'm glad they did. I think it was STS-26 or 27 or something like that when they went back. But the complexity, having worked on the Saturn and then having to work, and then having the capability to be able to switch over and work for Rockwell on the shuttle. The complexity of the software that you had to have to fly the thing, the software that you had to develop to test it on the ground, which there was no more sitting at a console like you did at Saturn, and it was command response. There would be a test conductor tell you, turn this on, turn that off. You would say, P1 transmitter on. You would say that over the loop. When he would say, turn P1 transmitter on. And if you're sitting at your station there, and there's 450 people sitting in that firing room at the consoles, you say P1 transmitter on. But when we went to the shuttle, they wrote goal procedures. They wrote these procedures that would do things through the computer systems that they would have in the firing room. Everything was computerized. They did away with the console concept of manual intervention. So you wrote these programs. You had to learn the language. And it was a little bit complex, but it was supposed to be simple English language statements instead of ones and zeros encoding and stuff like that they had earlier. Mm-hmm. And there's, I think, 2,300 goal programs that they called, and the goal says GOAL, Ground Oriented Aerospace Language, is what that stood for. And people had to learn that language, write those procedures, debug those procedures, make sure that they worked and didn't break something or burn something up. And you did that on a out in Houston on a rig out there that they call Sail, where you could it was a rig that had all the electronics just like a regular shuttle, and you would run your software program to make sure that things would work, and a lot of people found a lot of problems. It's called debugging. Yeah. And you finally got the program all right. Then you were ready to put it into a package for that particular. It hit 23 Go programs, 2,300 I think is what they said. Every time we launched the shuttle out here, and those programs would just run, automatically. You'd call in this one, call in that one, and then when you got down to the final count, you call in the big integration program that would put everything together. Like the launch sequencer did on the Apollo program, and everything was automated, And you had the checks and balances built into all of these programs, where if something was out of tolerance or this or that, it shuts you off right now. I mean, automatically shut you down and revert. You'd go in. You'd have to, if you had the vehicle loaded, you have to drain all the stuff out. If you had a scrub, or you had a launch delay, you would. They call them the countdown. I've forgotten, delays or something like that. That they would stop and try and analyze a problem. If they could, it's periodic points in the procedure where you could do that. I mean, in the countdown, and so holes, they would call them holes. Okay. I think just holes in the countdown, and they would have and then sometimes they have built-in holes. You come up to T-minus 4 hours, 45 minutes, you have a 3-hour hold. Built right in, so everything stops and everything, and it's okay to do that. Yeah. But then sometimes you would have these unplanned holes where you say something happened, let's hold here because we got replenish going on and all this stuff, and then you go work the problem, see if somebody can figure it out, and then you pick up the count at so many hours, minutes, or seconds, or whatever. But anyway, the shuttle was a very complex beast. We had that problem on 51L where one of the SRBs, the O-rings, failed right at liftoff. It was a very cold day. It was a bad decision that was made to go ahead and launch, and that teacher was on board that day.
Yeah, this was in 1986, right?
January of 86, January 28th, I believe, 86.
Yeah, I remember where I was. Like when really significant things happen like that. Like I remember Princess Diana when she died. I knew where I was, and then 9/11, I knew exactly where I was.
And when Kennedy got shot, you knew exactly where you were and what you were doing. The things that's right. It's burned. It's a psychological thing, burned into your brain.
So for
forever.
Me, when I was watching the shuttle, the Challenger go up, I was in school. I think I was in like 4th grade, somewhere around there. And I remember vividly, they brought the TVs into the assembly room so we could watch. And I think part of the reason is because there was a teacher on board. And so I think a lot of kids got to do that and watch it.
I was all over the country.
Oh, yeah.
Because that school teacher was on board.
Right. And like when it blew up, when that happened, that moment, like I think everyone was stunned. Nobody really knew what was happening.
Nobody really knew, including her parents.
Yeah,
they were stunned. The camera showed them when they were looking up at it. What the heck happened? You see these two smoke trails, smoke trails going off. Those were the SRBs that were left still powering.
Yeah, what happened? Take us back.
It was freezing that day. It was actually the night before. Even they had a tremendous freeze in Florida. I think it was down to 26 degrees, and there was ice all over the vehicle. And Rockwell was very concerned, even though they were no longer in control of launching the bird. Lockheed was, but Rockwell was still on an advisory capacity here and out at Downey, California. And when they were polling the various contractors, hey, how do you feel about launching? Let's go for launch or no go. And Rockwell said, we don't recommend launch today, because of the icing conditions all over the bird and the mobile launcher and everything. And one of the local people here was here at the party last night, was sent out there to the pad that day, and with his headset. He was here, John Tribe.
Yeah.
And he was sent out there to view because he was a Rockwell person, and the vehicle was Rockwell, built by Rockwell, and we're very concerned about those tile that are very, you can punch holes in them. They're made out of sand. Even though they do absorb the heat, 2,000 to 3,000 degrees of heat, we were concerned. The company was concerned about that, and we were. And they asked him over the loop, and this was played back several times. The Downey executives out there that were head of Rockwell asked him, "Hey, John, what's it look like out there?" And John Tribe, the words right out of his mouth, it looks like a scene out of Dr. Zhivago. And if you'd ever watched the movie Dr. Zhivago, when you're watching that movie, you're cold all the time.
Oh, wow.
But so there was ice on everything, and so Rockwell recommended don't do it. The Morton Thiokol people they were begging NASA not to launch that day because they were concerned about the O-rings not keeping the seal that were between the segments for each segment, because they were brought in segments, 4 segments, and stacked together, and these O-rings would seal those segments. There were only 2 of them, and they proved later on that when you put these O-rings, this material, rubber material O-ring, when in this ice water, became kind of rigid, and so. But the decision was made, hey, we got to get this teacher up there, and so NASA overruled all of the contractors, and they eventually convinced the executives in Morton Thiokol, because there were engineers screaming for them not to launch that day, and so the executives were browbeat a little bit and said, hey. When you got somebody that's paying your bill and all that stuff, saying, "Hey, we're going to launch, right? We're going to say yes." Yeah, okay, go for launch. And immediately at the launch, you could see the puff of smoke blowing out of, I think it was the right SRB, where that O-ring on the very first segment gave away. And as it gave away and started burning through on the way up, they had throttled the engines down, what they call throttle down and throttle up, to get when they were going through that area of max Q. They had throttled down, and the thing kept burning through, and then it was burning through the other side over on the tank side that held all the propellants in it. And the engines were trying. There was a vector, a moment on pushing on the side of the vehicle, and these engines were trying to compensate, for this. And it got the force got bigger and bigger, because it's instead of pushing this way, you got the engine still pushing you up, but you got this where the hole is blown out. It's a propulsion force, forcing the thing, and the engines automatically are trying to correct for that going up. And they're gimbling way harder and harder over. And then eventually it says you go for throttle up. And as soon as they said go for throttle up, I'm going from 60% back up to 104%, then you saw the thing at 72 seconds, I think it was, you saw the thing disintegrate. And that was a bad day and it was, NASA had to take the blame for that, even though it came out, that the recommendations were let's try it another day. It's really too cold.
Right.
Then we had we had a stand, what they call stand down, because of the incident and the investigations and all that stuff. And I think Chuck Yeager was on the investigative board for that Challenger launch. They had several different people, including Sally Ride and so forth, the first female astronaut. Very significant people on that board to do the investigation. And there was, oh man, it was all kinds of hey, this isn't going to happen again, right?
Yeah.
So sure enough, they took the SRBs, they redesigned the joints. They made 3 O-rings instead of 2, and same material, but they put heaters. They built in heaters into each joint, where if you ever had that cold, so you're never going to have that problem again. I mean, we found out the problem, we've engineered it, we've taken time down, we haven't launched for a year or two, whatever, and we've redesigned these. That'll never happen again, and it never did. But there's still other failure capabilities out there, right? So that was going up, right? Going up. We lost our 7 going up on that on Challenger that 28th day of January in '86. Coming down on Columbia in February 2003, February 1, I think, of 2003. I believe it was 2003. We're coming down, and little did we know that there was a hole about as big as a briefcase in the reinforced carbon. I think it was on the left wing of the orbiter that had been punched in by a piece of foam that had come off during launch from the tank, and they saw that piece of foam. Engineers wanted some of the high resolution cameras for the Air Force to take pictures of it. The unfortunate part would have been if they had seen the hole in the RCC. I mean, you still have to come down after so many days. You only had so much life support stuff on board, consumables. You had to bring it down. And what are you going to tell the crew? Hey, sorry, you're going to come down. You're going to die. But they were overruled. The engineers were overruled as far as the Air Force. They got cameras now. They can see you lighting a cigarette on the ground now. They're awesome. But that was waved off, and they came on down. And that hole in the wing, as they were coming in over our country there, it started disintegrating, and I think a lot of people have seen that on TV several times. And it scattered debris over 3 states. And we lost the 7 coming down, and the sensors that I was telling you about, the transducers that sent temperature and all that stuff in that left wing, they went off scale. The people in Houston are looking at that and they said, "Holy mackerel!" And we lost hydraulic pressure over there and all that stuff. Some major malfunction about to happen, and that's when it started coming apart. The crew on board there is witnessing their demise, a horrible thing. But here again, they did experiment after experiment with this gun, shooting at this RCC, trying to shoot this big chunk of foam that about the size of a briefcase at this wing. And they finally, one day, they rigged the system up, and they performed this test. And this is called reinforced carbon. It's supposed to take tremendous heat. It's on the leading edge of both wings. And they triggered this gun that shot this thing at that RCC and punched a hole this big in it to confirm that, holy mackerel, that piece of foam that we saw in the video going up caused the problem. Well, that'll never happen again. They used to paint over that orange material that they put on there. It's called insulation on the tank, but they found out if they didn't paint it, the first 2 were white, sprayed white, they would save 300 pounds, because every pound you save going up on a space vehicle, there's a pound you can convert to payload weight. So it was so they dropped off the paint after the second mission. And so that's why you always saw the orange tanks, just the raw insulation on there.
Interesting.
But anyway, and that's what happened, and that was Columbia. What
mission was that? Which mission?
That one was STS-126, I
Okay.
think.
So there was almost 10 more. There was 9
They-
more after
yeah.
that.
Now,
What did we learn from what did I mean? They've obviously there's a
George-
lot of pivoting and stuff, and every time there's a big design mistake, that's thankfully there's learned from.
that's what you learn from it.
and
You
how did
correct
they
it, and
correct
it
this
never
problem?
usually it never happens again. But at that particular point in time, since we'd already had the tragedy of 7 going up and now the tragedy of 7 coming down,
Yeah.
George Bush was president at the time. He signed an executive order saying this thing is still really dangerous, this shuttle, and we need to finish the space station, which that's what they were using it for, because the pieces were so big and the payload bay could accommodate all the pieces for the shuttle from all these countries. As soon as the last piece is in place, that will be the last mission for the shuttle. That was the last mission, STS-135, in July of 2011. And that's when I got my layoff, my first layoff in 51 years. And I could retire because I had enough time, 35 years with Boeing, 1 year with TRW, 15 years with Douglas, when McDonnell Douglas. And I could retire, but I walked out with 8,000 other people. We all got laid off, the end of the space program. Now, Obama had taken over as president during that particular period of time for Mission 135. He could have rescinded the order that George Bush had said, end the shuttle program after the last piece in orbit and keep us going, and because the shuttle could take up 7 people to the space station, and also huge pieces if you had to replace something. He could have rescinded it, but he kept the order in place, and it was George Bush's order. But George Bush, every time you cancel a major program or the program comes to an end, you always have another program that's going to replace it. There was another program that the Bush, under the Bush administration and NASA, that they had come up with called Constellation. That was going to be using a large booster called an Ares 5 for putting up large pieces, maybe to even stages to go to the moon. And then a solid rocket booster called Ares 1 that would take up a 3 or 4 man spacecraft up to an orbit. So there was 2 pieces of this. It's called a Constellation. Well, he canceled that program as well. Under the Obama did, saying it's. We don't have the money or the budget or whatever, and so that program was canceled. However, I don't know how they did it, but the spacecraft that they were developing for that constellation, they kept going. It was called Orion. Lockheed had the contract for it. They're still building it. That's going to be the new spacecraft. It's going to be a 4-person spacecraft instead of a 3-person spacecraft like the command module was for the Apollo. And Lockheed is being very close to having a test flight with that. But under the difference in the programs where all of that was developed, we developed all that stuff in 8.5 years. From the time Kennedy gave the speech to the time we were walking on the moon. We developed the Apollo command module, essentially the other stages, the main stages, the second stage and third stage service module in that 7.5 years. They're still working on that Orion spacecraft, trying to get it. It started about 10 years ago. But that's going to be the main vehicle that's going to be used on the new space system that NASA's designed called SLS, Space Launch System. And it's going to be about 9 million pounds of thrust at liftoff instead of 7.5 million. So it will be more powerful than the Saturn.
So you think that there's going to be, is there going to be another chapter of the space program?
There definitely is. The new chapter is called Commercial Space.
Okay. Can you talk about that a little bit?
And that commercial space is, hey, finally, NASA is not the only one on the block.
Because
you've
of
got
a couple
Elon
of really
Musk,
smart entrepreneurs. Right?
and you with a lot of money. Got to have a lot of money. Jeff Bezos now is the other guy with his Blue Origins.
Yeah.
And developing, he'll be the first person. He decided on building his manufacturing plant to manufacture his rockets,
Which we drove by and saw recently.
We saw that recently, and
it's
it's amazing. It's a $200 million investment. He will be the very first person to ever build his rocket here and launch it here. He has a lease on a couple of complexes over on the Cape side, Complex 36 and 11, I think, are the 2 ones. And we were hoping he was going to choose this launch site right next door to his where he's going to build his rockets to build his engines, because he also builds his own engines. He's an amazing man.
Wow.
amazing space venture that he's started.
Yeah.
But he's got the money to do it.
Oh yeah.
And
Second richest man in the world. Is that where
he was for 3 hours 2
Oh.
weeks ago. He was richer than Bill Gates.
Yeah.
For 3 hours, but his stock went down and Bill Gates popped up.
So
again.
now he's second. Right?
He's second.
That's
yeah.
okay.
The
I think he's okay with that.
92 billion, I think is what his net worth was last week.
Wow.
But anyway, the man he said when he was 5 years old, he witnessed, like the whole world did, the Apollo 11 landing, and he was so impressed with it. He's always been impressed with space travel, and so he's there. It's essentially a competition, but it's called commercial space now, where you have individuals now, not wholly NASA, but if you build a vehicle or a rocket today, and you say, I want to put 3 astronauts on it, well, who do the astronauts work for? Who pays the astronauts? NASA. So NASA says, hey, my people going to fly on your vehicle. You have to have my certification that your vehicle is safe enough for my people to fly on. And so the astronauts in the astronaut corps are still under NASA.
Okay.
However, NASA has the checkbook to say, develop, hey, Bezos or Elon Musk, develop this thing so that we can start flying our own people up to our space station instead of spending $82 million for one seat on a Soyuz spacecraft, and we have to write the check to Putin. And I'm hoping that next year that Elon Musk may be the first one. That Boeing is also competing with, they're not really competing. They've got 2 different programs that are trying to get a spacecraft to start sending our own people on our own rockets on American soil, and that $82 million check to Putin every time $82 million to go up, $82 million to come down to occupy that one seat in that Soyuz 3-seat spacecraft, that's going to go away, hopefully next year. And we're thinking Elon Musk may beat everybody, but Boeing is right behind him. And then you got this guy coming along, Bezos. So it's a whole new chapter in space now. It's not just NASA anymore. With this, what they call commercial crew, commercial this, commercial that, meaning private individuals have invested and built their own rockets, and NASA will say, hey, oh, you built your own rocket, Elon Musk, you built your Falcon 9, it works good. You got your spacecraft that we can put supplies in to resupply the space station. We'll pay you $1.4 billion or whatever for 12 missions to resupply. We give you the check, you do it. Well, he had a couple of bumps in the road because he had a couple of failures, but CRS-12 is going up as the 12th mission, I think, is going up in a week or so. You're not going to be here. And what the amazing part is about this guy, this Musk guy, nobody has ever, after they use their booster, to get something in space, have the thing fly back and land on either a barge or on Cape Canaveral over here. It is one of the most amazing sights that I have ever witnessed in all of my 51 years, to see that thing launch and go up, and you could continue to hear it. And then the next thing you know, 8 minutes later, you see this thing come streaking down, the engines light up again, and it settles down on what they call landing zone 1 over in the Cape side. And you start walking back to your car, and 8 seconds or 9 seconds later, boom, sonic boom.
Sound barriers broken.
You get it coming down, you don't get it going up.
Wow.
And it's one of the most amazing things. And he say every time he sticks one of those, he sticks one of those back on the ground or on the barge out there for certain missions. It depends on the profile of the mission, the trajectory and all that, as to whether he lands on a barge 300 miles out or lands here. But seeing him land here, every time he sticks one, he saves $60 million for the next person if they want to fly that. Now, he's already reflown, I think, 2 of these boosters that he's retrieved back. They come in, some of them come in on the barge. You see them out there. They're all burnt up and, from the heat of reentry and all that. But he says I can launch 10 of them without even, retesting them. I think I can get 10 launches out of them. If I get more than that, I might have to, rejuvenate some other systems or something.
Wow.
But we'll always have test fire. And each one of his rockets have 9 engines. He's developed his own engines called Merlins.
Wow.
So he's developed his own rocket, his own engines. Jeff Bezos, same thing, his own rocket. And Jeff Bezos, his name is his rockets after astronauts. And he calls the New Glenn, the New Shepard. These are astronauts' names.
Clever.
That's the name of his rockets. But anyway, that's what's going on out here, and I'm glad to see it. And what I call it, a renaissance or revival, whatever you want to call it, in the space program. We're coming back, and we got a new sheriff in town. I think he's a little bit maybe more pro-space than the last administration, and I'm hoping that way. It remains to be seen, but it don't matter because these private individuals are going to say, hey, I got a rocket here. Hey, Eutelsat in Europe, you want to fly on my bird? Give me 150 million or 100 million, you can fly on my bird. NASA's not even involved anymore. It doesn't say yes or no. But they get the permission to use their facilities. Or at least NASA's leasing their own facilities to these people now. And Elon Musk has got Pad 39A where we launched the Saturns, all the Saturns from, most all of them. I think we did one on 39B. And he's got that thing. I thought it would take him a year or two to get the 39, Complex 39, where we did launch the Saturn from, and most of the shuttles from, by the way, to convert that to his Falcon, Falcon 9. Rocket, I think it's called. Yeah, I think it's Falcon, what they call Falcon 9.
Wow.
And so he's launched a couple of them from 39A already, and he's relaunched a couple of the ones he's retrieved. So and saved millions for.
He's resourceful.
Yeah,
isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. It's amazing.
That's incredible, and it's all happening right here in your backyard.
Right here in our backyard, and I'm I'm 25. I'm a 20-minute drive to the south gate of where all that's happening.
And it's neat because that's where we started.
That's where we started.
That's where everything started.
And that's where it went. We've gone into a lull for the last 6-7 years. The end of the space program as we knew it for people, man space. Well, I still call it man space. I'm stuck with that. But the man space program ended for us, our capabilities, in 2011 when I got laid off with the other 8,000 people. And but now we're looking ahead, we're looking forward, and it's a new era in space. And it's going to continue, and I can't wait to see when they roll out their first when Jeff Bezos, Mr. Amazon.com, rolls out his first rocket out here to launch it, and his own engines. He decided to build his engine factory up in Huntsville, and so he'll be flying his engines down here. A lot of people were hoping that he'd build his engine plant right next to the rocket factory. You roll out the rocket, you go roll it over next door to the engine, have the engine mounted, and then roll it out to the pad. But we weren't lucky enough to. I mean, he had his reasons for going up there, and I don't think they gave him the breaks, the tax breaks, and all that stuff here that he wanted and was looking for. But Alabama did. So he's building his engine up there, but next year is really going to be exciting, and people in space again from our soil.
Yeah, that's exciting. I wonder what's next. I mean, we've been to the moon, and you were a part of that
historic event.
And what's next? I mean, Mars ain't the kind of place to raise kids.
I want to say something.
In fact, it's cold
Mars.
as hell.
Mars is people. When I'm out there, they ask me a question. Well, how do you feel about Mars? And going back to Mars, I said, well, what's his name has already walked all over Mars. Go ask Hollywood instead of spending the $100 billion. I've forgotten
Watch the movie. Yeah.
Who was the guy it wasn't Brad Pitt. It was the other guy. But anyway,
was it Clooney?
The Martian. No.
Oh yeah, Matt Damon.
Matt Damon
and the Martian. Yeah,
that's
right.
I said, Matt Damon's already done it, and then they laugh a little bit. But I do remind them that, hey, that is still a major NASA goal.
Yeah.
And they may pull it off, and Buzz Aldrin is 100% back. The second man to walk on the moon is 100% support of it and back to it. And he says, you can do it, we can do it. The only thing that I tell people is it took us a little over 2 days to go to the moon. It's 9 months to go to the Mars.
Oh, my goodness.
And when you think about the logistics of getting there with maybe 3-4 humans for a 9-month ride, keeping them occupied, you got to feed them, you got to have air to breathe, you got to have waste management, and all of these logistics for 9 months. And you want to come home? 9 more months. Wow. But so that's why the deal would be to try and go up one way. Have habitat modules that they're trying to develop right now to put on Mars, send them up there to where if they land on Mars, they have a place to go. They don't have to come back immediately, and they can be in the development of a return vehicle. That I've been out here 2 or 3 months. I've done some rock farming, whatever, and we're ready to bring them back home.
Yeah.
But we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. We're not. We're talking a lot of money here.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, you're going to for us to do it by ourselves. It would be an endeavor that I would think that we would almost have to share with like Russia, China. Unavoidably, it's too big for one country, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Now, it should be. We shouldn't have to do that, but it's such a gigantic undertaking that. Yeah. It's almost like the space station we have up there now. There's 15 countries involved up there. And there's some main players, but there's 15 different countries. That's why they call it an international space station, is because, it wasn't just the U.S. The original space station was supposed to be Japan, us, and I think Canada. And that one was scrubbed, called Space Station Freedom, back in the Ronald Reagan days. And that one was canceled. And then Clinton came on board. And they transitioned from Space Station Freedom and the 3 countries to International Space Station. He wanted to make sure Russia got involved in that and was a main player, and they are. And as far as our situation with Putin and Russia and so forth right now, and the saber rattling and all this stuff that's going down, I think the space part is being separate and apart, and they have built friendships. We have built friendships with their astronauts and vice versa. That they're keeping politics out of it right now. However, Putin could say, "You want to go? You want to go to your space station? You don't have to pay me $82 million. Go buy you one of those. What do you call one of those boards that you jump on that you bought?"
Oh, geez.
It's not a springboard. But anyway, go buy one of those and try and get to your space station.
Oh, my goodness.
It's a trampoline.
A trampoline. Okay, I was going to say that.
Yeah, I lost for words there.
Yeah.
Go get a trampoline and see if you can get there. I mean, he's holding those cards because the only way we can get there right now is with writing them a check to Russia.
Wow.
And hopefully that'll change next year. And everybody's praying for it, and I think it will.
Fascinating.
Thank God.
Yeah, this is incredible.
But we've shot the moon here.
Yeah. Well, let's start wrapping it up here.
Let's wrap it up then.
This has been so interesting. Let's just start wrapping up with life, and I think there's a lot of takeaways. I like to try to extract takeaways from my interviews, and I've got a few already. I was thinking about design, and that's my audience for this show, especially as designers who are trying to make a difference and trying to make things better.
Yeah.
And I think just some of the lessons and unfortunately, like you said, with space travel, I mean, one of the riskiest things around, like, that and warfare and things.
And it always will be.
Yeah. And so I think that the design lessons learned from the unfortunate fire that occurred, let's make the door open on the outside so we can do it faster and save lives. And so that was a big lesson learned. And those guys were sacrifices. They sacrificed willingly. Were willing to sacrifice themselves for those lessons.
They knew the risk. They knew it.
And then I think about the Challenger and those sacrifices as well, and the lessons learned to move things forward. And sometimes, unfortunately, that has to happen. And but I think that the redesigning, adding the extra O-ring, reinforcing it with heat, and just the things like that we would not have known about.
That's right.
So I think there's just some incredible design lessons
That's right.
that have been learned and that have helped propel this whole program forward. And things, and God bless, the memories of all those who were willing to sacrifice themselves for those learnings and for our
it's
greater
called lessons
achievement.
learned is what what in space they say lessons learned, those two words, and that's powerful, and you essentially you hit it right on the head. It's an experience that it's a fantastic experience. I am so proud of our nation to this day, even though there's a lot of people that don't believe we ever did it, that we really did it, but I know that we did it.
Yeah.
And each day that I live, and each time I go out there and do my duty out there, I am more proud and more proud because that event is the greatest technological achievement by man ever up to this point. Nobody has done it, and we still haven't done it yet. When we go back to the moon and then maybe go on to Mars in years from now, yes. But right now, that still is the most outstanding achievement. And I almost put it up against winning World War II. Because that was one of the biggest. We won that war, and that was probably the last of the winnable wars, and it was so significant in this whole world. Well, guess what was the next significant event in this whole world in that same century? Landing and walking on the moon and bringing the people back to Earth.
Yes.
But the loss of life with World War II, we didn't lose. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't. You weren't putting your life on. The astronauts were, but I mean, building the machine and all that stuff, you weren't in harm's way. And people, as I told you, they come up and say thank you for your service, and I say, yeah, that's reserved for the greatest generation that put their life on the line and died for our country. But really, we're from the space generation, and we didn't have to put our life on the line. We did do a great achievement, but it was a big difference. So, it would be better for you to say thank you for your participation and reserve the thank you for your service for the men and women that fought and died for our country.
Yeah, well said.
Well.
And another takeaway too is all the adversity you've overcome. I mean, we talked about it. Not the most ideal family life, dysfunctional, just like a lot of us. We all have dysfunctionality.
I really did. I had to grow up with that.
Yeah.
And for somehow, we overcome it.
Yeah.
And we keep going.
Right. And then the accident when you're only 8 years old. Just not even barely discovering what life's about,
right.
And then having this travesty, this tragedy occur to you that just completely changed the course of your life and could have changed
my life.
Could have changed your life far differently, but
That's
this
right.
is another lesson of adversity.
Right.
And then these shattered dreams, wanting to be a Major League Baseball pitcher, wanting to be an aviation pilot, being told you can't do those things because of what happened to you.
That was a downer.
Right. And also I think about your college, your education. You had every right to ask for help. Being disabled, having a disability, and there's things available for you. You never did that. You never took a free handout. You earned it. You made sure that you could earn that your keep and stick with your education. And you got through that. And then everything, in the space program, all the adversity, so you are an example of overcoming adversity, a shining example.
Well, I appreciate those kind words.
What inspired you? I want to know, how did you do it? What drove you?
Just attempting, trying to ignore my adversity and my affliction, and getting up every morning and trying to live a normal life. And what did those things that I was so interested in, like playing sports and joining the Air Force. I mean, I couldn't do it, but guess what? Guess where it led?
Right.
51 years putting the bread on the table and being part of some of the most exciting and fruitful years in an industry that is still beginning to flourish again. And I mean, what more can you say? I was just, I almost like to say, I remember this ball player, one of the greatest of all time. His name was Lou Gehrig, and he made a speech in 1937 or 39 when he discovered that he had the disease. He was out in Yankee Stadium, and what a great person. But I remembered the beginning of his speech was, "Today I consider myself one of the luckiest men on the face of the earth." And so I would like to take off from him. I'm almost breaking up about it. I consider myself the second luckiest man on the face of the earth today. Sorry about that.
No, don't apologize.
But I do have, that speech, I'll never forget it. As a boy, I saw the movie with Gary Cooper in it, and that was moving. But I was really very, very lucky. And you can say luck, or you can say I was blessed, because I also believe I was blessed. Awesome. Thank God.
Amen.
Amen.
Now, this is awesome, Dad. There's people that are struggling right now, and they have
That's right.
Seemingly insurmountable adversity like you had. Do you have any advice for them? Do you have a word for them? Just something that comes to mind?
Yeah, I do.
Maybe they feel like they want to give up even.
Shake it off and keep trudging. And I'm not going to use the word keep fighting. I just keep going forward. And don't look back at your affliction or your adversity or say, oh, gee whiz, I got hurt when I was 8 years old and almost lost my leg. And, holy mackerel, what am I going to do now? No, never look back. I will never, ever forget the incident. You can't, because it was so traumatic at the time. It will always be there, the smell of the wreck and all that stuff and what I went through. But the beauty of it was that I was allowed to have that at a very early age, 8 years old. And that was a blessing in disguise, because I wanted to be like any other kid, normal kid. And that's my advice. Don't look back at the past and be thinking about it in an adverse way. Just say, hey, I'm going forward now with my life. And you'd be surprised where it'll take you. Yeah, look where it took me.
Right.
And I've been walking on this bum leg that they said was going to wear out on me, or I'd have to take it off after 10 years, for 72 years. And I'm still walking on it. After those doctors said he won't get 10 years out of it. And I also pitched off the mound in Lake Worth, and pitched a no-hitter my second game, and I won 4 out of 5. Lost my first one with this leg. And the honor and privilege that I had of pitching on a mound in the little town of Lake Worth, Florida, where one of the greatest left-hand southpaw pitchers of all time got his start. His name was Herb Score. Mm-hmm. And he would have been in the Hall of Fame by now 2 or 3 times over. Mm-hmm. He was drafted by the Cleveland Indians as a pitcher, but he started, and I pitched on the same mound where he got his start in Lake Worth High School, and what an honor and a privilege that was. And unfortunately, Herb Scorer got a line drive in his face from Gil McDougall off the bat of Gil McDougall, and it hit him right and it ended his career. But he had, I think, a strikeout record for 2 years or 3 years, and he was on Sports Illustrated a couple of times. I mean, for being the Rookie of the Year and everything. And that's another thing that, hey, you'll pass by these people that have done amazing things. They said, this guy's too wild. He'll never make it to the major leagues. Well, guess what? You might have told him that, but he didn't believe it. And so that's another story that hey, he kept looking forward.
Yeah.
And he got to the Cleveland Indians, and he did amazing feats with them, strikeout records. He had over 100-mile-an-hour fastball and a breaking ball, and he did magic. But he didn't. With people that told him, "You're too wild. You're too wild." I might be too wild, but I broke some records with the Cleveland Indians. So I kind of use that as as something that's very similar that that I went through. Hey, look forward, don't look back, and keep the faith, baby. That's what I recommend. Keep the faith. And you'd be surprised where it'll take you.
I love that. Yeah, there's a quote I heard recently. I can't remember who said it, but something to the effect of, so many of us, I think we overestimate what we can do in 1 year, and we underestimate what we can do in 10 years.
That's a good quote.
Right?
That's a good one. I have to agree.
Yeah. So you just turned 80. Congratulations, happy birthday. We just celebrated last night. It was an incredible party, incredible turnout.
It was.
And you had some of the Rocket people with you.
I had several
here,
people that worked out with me 50 years ago. That's right.
Yeah, it was amazing. And how's it feel? How's it feel to be 80?
I'll tell you what, onward and upward. Now I'm looking for 90.
All right, that's the spirit.
Now, if the old gimp here will stay with me, and even if it doesn't, you got walkers, you got electrical carts and so forth like that. I'll get one if I have to, but I'm still walking around on this thing at 80, and I am very proud to be able to do that. And I'm just looking forward. I got a little bit of a health problem. Everybody's got this thing called AFib. I have it. A lot of people have it now. It's almost like a normal thing for people when they get in their upper years, and they're finding out more and more. That's a lot of people have passed away because they didn't know they had it, and they get on the blood thinner, and so I'm on it, and I'm hoping it's going to keep me ticking. But the only thing that I fear is falling. That's the only thing. You get a little clumsy when you get older, and a lot of people fall. They break a hip or break an arm or a leg or something. They go in the hospital, and So I'm praying that's what I don't have a fall.
Yeah,
and that's
me too. Me too. Has it gone by fast?
What's that?
Has life gone? I mean, being 80 now, does it feel like it's gone by fast?
Oh man, yeah. But you know what? I've seen a lot.
Yeah.
I've done a lot.
That's right.
And I have a lot to be proud of. And I have a fantastic family that showed up for this thing for the first time in 5, 6, 7, I don't know how many years. All of us have been together. Me, your mama, and the three of you guys. And Catherine coming down from New York. That in and of itself was such a tremendous blessing for my 80th birthday. I don't think I could ask for anything. I don't think there's anything you could ask for more than that.
Yeah, it was
and
incredible.
then having the wonderful neighbors that I have, that we're living in a beautiful neighborhood. I'm retired. I've been there and done that, and I am one blessed person.
Yes,
really am.
Any regrets?
Well, spending more time with you guys growing up instead of being out there at the Rocket Ranch. But I did spend some time with y'all down at number 9, trying to teach you how to fish.
Oh yeah,
and
you throw the baseball with us too.
I did throw a baseball with you every now and then, but I wish, like your older brother often reminds me, you never finished that fort for us out there. And those between those cabbage palms out there
At Fernwood.
I
I remember.
and I he's right. I gave up on it, and I don't know why, but I started on it and never finished it. And he always reminds me of that. You never finished that fort. And I apologize, but you guys have stuck with me, and what a wonderful family I have, and what a wonderful mama you have. She is the best thing. That I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, what a lot of people do, and some big, some not so big, but one of the greatest things I ever did was discovering your mama at the Apollo 14 launch party that we had on top of some building down in Cocoa Beach, and she was sitting there on a couch with some elderly lady there, and she had just come back to the company. McDonnell Douglason was the secretary for the propulsion group for the S-4B, the engine where Dick Carlson worked and so forth. As a matter of fact, she was his secretary. She was? Yeah. She wasn't Dick Carlson, but she was a secretary for the group that he was in.
Oh, how funny.
And,
I didn't realize that.
And it's right around the corner and we were the Saturn Electronics group. And responsible for all the electrical systems on the S-4B, third stage of the moon rocket, and meeting her and and dating her, and her being from a naturalized you're born in Florida like me, Florida cracker, born in MEMS and raised in born in Sanford, raised in MEMS, and me being born in Florida, it was a match made in heaven, as what a lot of people would say. And we got 4 more years to get to my next milestone, which is our 50th wedding anniversary. But the biggest milestone, like I did say last night, would be my bucket list is another 2 years. Good Lord, give me another 2 years, so I can be here for the 50th anniversary of the launching of Apollo 11. Which is, don't get it confused with the moon walk, which was 4 days later, but we launched on July 16th of 1969, and I'm looking for July 16th of 2019. It's just 2 years away. That will be a monumental event, not only here, but in the country. Yeah. And a lot of people that weren't born yet and so forth will see a lot of history, a lot of video, a lot of celebration, and I'm planning on being out there at the Saturn V Museum, where I have a badge to get in out there for free. But Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, has his Share Space Foundation out there once in every July, and he has some big shot come down. He had Jeff Bezos down for this one just a few weeks ago his main event. It's a foundation for raising money for his foundation that helps kids, get into space and become astronauts. So it's a good thing. Yeah. But the minimum ticket is $1,000 a person. Oh wow! It goes up to $20,000.
Budget for that.
But he's had his function there, and as I said last night, I hope he's not going to be standing there at the door saying, "Give me $1,000 to get in here." I'm just going to have my badge. I want to get in, but it's a good thing. His money, for that, it's a good foundation. Yeah. And so if I could, I would have bought a ticket, because I'd like to go out there and have seen and shook hands with Jeff Bezos and so forth, because I think he is going to be a big shot in space here.
Yeah, sure.
But that's what I'm like. So my 2 bucket list items now, the next 2 years from now, 50th anniversary, Apollo 11, July 16th, not July 20th. That's when they walked on the moon. And then 2 years after that, August 14th, that'd be 2021, 50 years. All right. With my beautiful little bride, yo mama.
I love it. Dad, thanks so much.
Yeah.
We've talked for almost 3 hours, incredibly, and
it doesn't seem
a little
like
warm
that
in here, and I'm sorry, but
I love it. Yeah, that's what I do. That's where James learned how to talk so much from me. You turn him on, you can't get him on. But I've loved it. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share. And sorry for breaking down there, but every
No,
time
don't
I think
apologize.
about Lou Gehrig, and that's another thing. One final thought.
Yeah, please.
When I watch the Wounded Warriors on TV and see what they've gone through and their arms blown off and their legs blown off, that's the point I wanted to make. I am the luckiest man in the world. I got nothing, even though I almost lost my leg, and they have the prosthetics now that they could cut that thing off and above the knee, and I would be in better shape. But when I compare myself to them, there is no comparison. I had a pimple on an elephant's butt compared to what they've been through.
Wow.
And I mean that sincerely. They have really paid a big price, and I hold those people in very high esteem.
Well, Dad, this has been incredibly inspiring and incredibly insightful. You thankfully have helped capture history here today. As this is recorded, this is
Well,
going to
some
live
of what
on.
I can remember.
Yeah, well, you did a great job remembering a lot of details, and this has been incredible. And I just want to thank you again for this opportunity, and this is unforgettable for me. And I just want to say, fight on, my dad.
Continue the good fight. But actually, the opportunity that you've given me here to finally tell my story to you, and hopefully you'll share it with members of your family, because that's what we got. There's a lot of people that record themselves, for future reference and looking and entertaining, I guess it would be a better word, for your family members.
Yeah, well, it's a
And
canon.
You've
It's a
done
canon
it.
now.
Yeah, it is, and it's great. And you being my son, my second born, doing this with you, man, it can't get any better than that, can it?
No, I don't think so.
No way. So
Thanks,
let's
Pop.
sign off and let's go see that movie.
Yeah.
What's the name of it?
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see that. I understand it is fantastic, and as you know, I'm a World War II buff.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to that maybe tonight.
Well, Roger that in 10-4.
Okay.
Signing off.
Over and out.
Over and out, good buddy.
Yeah, okay.
Moon mission, moving on up. Let's see how high she goes, boys. Moon mission, fuel her on up and let's get the hell out of this noise. Black distance, silent as time. Tell me, how far does it go? Buckle me in and I'll see for myself and report to you folks down below. I'll be a sweet sailor up in the sky. Don't waste a wish for me, dear. I've had enough of this earth-binding stuff. There's nothing for me down here. by, then replace you with brambles